Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this session of GearUp for Research Communications, brought to you by the Stanford Science and Engineering Libraries and the Lane Medical Library. I'm Julie Sweetkind-Singer, the Associate University Librarian for Science and Engineering Libraries, and I'm your host for this morning's session. The theme of our event this year is research communication. At this event, individuals from across the campus will share effective methods and unique ideas for communicating the meaning and significance of your research. We hope you will take away some ideas on how to amplify your research in the future. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the GearUp site after this event. If you have questions for the speaker, please type your questions in the Q&A box. Your questions will be read out by the chat moderator. The chat feature is open, but we will not be looking at that in terms of questions that you can answer, that you would be asking the speaker. At the end of the talk, we'll post a link where you can suggest topics for our future events. Thank you for attending. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Kristen Sinani. She's an associate professor of health at Research and Policy. She writes about science and health for a wide audience and has taught statistics and writing at Stanford for more than a decade. Today, she'll discuss how to talk to the press and prepare for presenting your research. Welcome, Kristen. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to talk with the press, and I really want this to be an interactive session. So I've got some slides, but I've also left a lot of time for questions. So if you have questions as I go along, feel free to type them in the chat box, and the moderators can feel free to interrupt me, and I can get those questions answered as we go along. Happy to answer questions about how to talk with the press or just about science communication in general. Just to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from in my background. So when I finished my PhD at Stanford, I actually had decided to completely bail on academia. I was done with academia, and I was going to go and be a science journalist. And so I did the one-year science journalism, science writing program at UC Santa Cruz, which is a fabulous program. And if anybody wants to talk to me about that program offline later, I'm happy to answer questions about that. I somehow found my way back into academia, though, and continued, though, to do a lot of freelance science writing for magazines. And so I've interviewed a lot of scientists over the years, so I can tell you about what science journalists are looking for when we interview you. I occasionally will get interviewed by a science journalist for my academic work, so I can also talk a little bit about the other perspective, being on the other side of the microphone. So first of all, why do you want to talk with the press at all? Why bother? And I think in this day and age, there's a lot of science misinformation out there, as we all know. And I think scientists actually have somewhat of an obligation to try to educate the public, to try to fight misinformation and improve the public's perception of science. There's also a selfish reason, of course, to talk with the press, which is that it can help your career. It increases your visibility. It gets your research out there. It makes you more well-known. Also, if you have a paper coming out that's going to get press coverage, it's better if you are part of the process of communicating that research. If you step out of that process, others may or may not get that research communicated quite correctly. By being part of the process, you help to control the narrative and make sure that your science is communicated effectively and accurately. It's important to understand when you're talking with the press where science journalists are coming from. So science journalists, their job is to communicate science to wide audiences. And you have to think about where the general public is coming from with regards to science. Most people maybe aren't interested in science for science's sake. They may not be interested in the molecule for the molecule's sake. Most people may have had some science in high school or college, but they're not necessarily going to pick up a magazine and read about science unless it's told in a way that's compelling. The job of the science journalist really is to tell a story. And we're telling a story not to make the science inaccurate, but to make the science compelling and digestible and relatable to a wide audience. So storytelling is extremely powerful. And that's where the science journalist is coming from. They want to deliver the science, deliver it accurately, but packaged in a way that's easier for a general audience to get into, that's compelling and people want to read about. So remember, what are the elements of a story? A story has characters, it has conflict, it has a setting, it has a suspense, details, description, action. And so when you're talking with science journalists, just keep in mind that this is where they're coming from. They're looking to have characters and conflict, and they're looking for these kinds of elements so that they can tell a story to make your science as compelling as possible. And just a little bit of, why this is very powerful. So again, science, you may be very interested in your science because you're interested in that molecule or that cell, and you know why it's interesting, and it's just inherently interesting to you. Think about where a lot of the public is coming from, though. They may not have that inherent interest. So they're not going to read about your molecule or your cell unless it's packaged in a way that is compelling. And so here's an example of a story that was in the Atlantic 2 years ago. This is a great example of science journalism. The story was called "The Next Plague is Coming, Is America Ready?" So it's quite prescient, for the moment we find ourselves in now. And I'll just read a little bit of the beginning of this story. So he starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, shortly after the sun spills over the horizon. The city of Kikwit doesn't so much wake up as ignite. Loud music blares from car radios. Shops fly open along the main street. Dust-sprayed jeeps and motorcycles zoom eastward toward the town's bustling markets, or westward towards Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo's capital city. The air starts to heat up, its molecules vibrating with absorbed energy, so too the city. By late morning, I'm away from the bustle on a quiet, exposed hilltop some 5 miles down a pothole-ridden road. As I walk, desiccated shrubs crunch underfoot and butterflies flit past. The only shade is cast by the 2 lines of trees which mark the edge of a site where more than 200 people are buried, their bodies piled into 3 mass graves, each about 15 feet wide and 70 feet long. Nearby, a large blue sign says, "In memory of the victims of the Ebola epidemic in May 1995. So you can see that this is a compelling story, right? And so it's drawing the reader in. It reads almost like a novel, but there's important scientific information in this story. It's talking about the risk of pandemics, and it gets into the science, but it doesn't start with the science. It doesn't start with the virus and how the virus is shaped. It starts with a story with characters and a setting. So again, this is where science journalists are coming from, because those stories are powerful. They get people to pay attention and think about the science. I really like, this was in a Nature Jobs blog post. This is a postdoctoral researcher who's telling scientists why she thinks it's important to communicate your science to wider audiences. And she says, professional science communicators are important in keeping science in the public eye. Despite this, it's essential that scientists don't forget our individual responsibility and privilege to be science communicators in our daily lives. How do we stem the tide of science untruths? And she says, I would suggest a key first step is learning to understand where people are coming from. They're enthusiastic about a wonder cure. They're scared for their children. They're anxious about the future. Rather than dismissing these feelings with cold fact, we can try to empathize. We share these emotions. We understand. Not by relying on facts, percentages, and graphs, but acknowledging the underlying concerns. And I think this is just a really good way of understanding where science journalists are coming from. We are trying to connect with readers. We are trying to, again, package the science in a way that is digestible and relatable to readers. So when we're talking with scientists, we're really trying to get at some of these human elements and some of the wider significance of the work. All right, so a little bit of the nuts and bolts that you may or may not be aware of when it comes to talking with the media. So there's sort of 2 types of interviews that you might be asked to do. Every institution has its own communications office, and their job is really to help you communicate your science to a wider audience. They are working for you and for the institution, and they want to get your science out there to the wider media. So if you are asked to be interviewed by a public information officer at your institution, you're going to have more control over that story. They will write a press release which goes out to the wider media. When you're interviewed by them, they're going to work with you to shape the story. So they will send the entire story back to you. They will have you check your quotes. So you get a lot more control over that story because, again, the public information officer is working for the institution. They want to make sure that everything is accurate and that you're happy with it. It's very different when you're interviewed by an independent journalist. So somebody might email you and say, hey, I see you've got a paper in Science. Can I talk with you about it? And it's great to do those interviews too, but just be aware it's a different type of situation, because an independent journalist does not want to run the story past you before it runs. They often don't have time. They also don't want you to muck with, sometimes scientists give really good quotes, and then if you run it back by them, they think it's too conversational and they change them. They add caveats. So we generally will not run anything back by you. Occasionally a publication will have a fact checker who might call you up and check some direct quotes, but for the most part, you're not gonna be able to see that story ahead of time. So those are two very different experiences, and you should just be aware of their differences. In general, independent journalists want to talk directly with you. They don't want to go through your communications officer, so they'll reach out to you, and it's fine to accept an interview with them, but just be aware that it's a little bit different. You don't have as much control over the story. All right, so let's say you've accepted an interview, and you're going to be doing a phone interview or an in-person interview with a science journalist. It's important to understand what they're looking for. And again, it relates back to this idea that we're trying to tell a story. So we're looking for those elements of the story. The science, of course, the technical part is very important. But what you'll find, a lot of science journalists are pretty skilled at reading scientific papers and translating those for general audiences. They may be able to do that without your help. They may have specific questions about the science that they will ask you. But in general, we're not so much looking for you to explain the nitty-gritty details of the science. We're looking more for those human storytelling elements. So we're looking for things we can quote you on, and often those are kind of big picture things. Like, what is the overall significance of this work? Why is it important? So if you give a nice, kind of a sweeping comment about the significance of the work, that often makes a good first quote. So every science news story will have a sort of a structure to it. And one of the elements is you bring in the scientist talking at some point. That's the first quote of the story. It often makes a good first quote to have the scientist saying what they think is the significance and big picture importance of the work. So for example, in a story I was doing, this was my first quote, and the scientist said, "This is really the first evidence that there was something functional that was contributed from this admixture that was useful for modern humans." So this is a scientist saying, hey, here's the big picture significance of the work. So we're looking for those kinds of things. We're looking to understand how your research affects people. In other words, our readers. You might work on cells or a molecule or some kind of particle in physics. How does that connect back to people? We're always looking to understand that and put that in the article so our readers connect with it. We may be looking for advice for readers. Not all publications, but some publications which are targeted at very general audiences may actually be looking to give a little bit of advice, maybe something that goes beyond the specific science in the article that you have coming out, but give some general advice for readers. So I wrote a health column for Allure magazine for a decade, and it's a beauty magazine. Actually, I was writing about scientific articles coming out in the scientific literature, but they were very much targeted at the general audience. And our target audience was 18 to 35-year-old women. And so I was writing about things like how to quit smoking and how to protect your skin against sun damage. So often when I talk to scientists, I ask them about the specific article, but I also wanted them to give a little bit of advice for women. So here's how you protect your skin. Here's how you avoid the flu. Here's some advice for quitting smoking. So that might be, depending on the publication, something a journalist is after. Journalists also write about a specific topic because it's newsworthy. There's some reason they're writing about it in this moment. That is often just like the paper is coming out in Science, or the paper is coming out in Nature or JAMA or something, a high-profile journal. It also could be because your science somehow connects to something in the news, like COVID currently, but there has to be some kind of news hook. So we want to understand what's different or new about your research. Why is it important now? Just be careful. Science journalists like colorful prose because it makes you sound human. It's lively, right? And so you're a little careful if you use colorful prose, it's likely to get quoted. And just to give you an example, this is not an article I wrote, but this is an article I use in my teaching. And the scientist said, women think as they get menopause, they'll get old, ugly, useless, and crazy, Grady told me on the phone. They think if they take hormones, it'll be okay. Then they attribute all the good feelings they have to hormone therapy. And so that's an example of a quote that's got some colorful prose. So that's why it made it into the article. And one that I was just reading on COVID said, I'm just going to say it. It feels like we're playing Russian roulette with our kids and our staff. Also kind of colorful and lively prose. Those things will tend to make into the article. we're looking for stories. So if you can tell us a story about, like, how did you come up with the idea for this research? Maybe when you were in the lab, something popped up that was unexpected. That can make an interesting story. And often those kinds of anecdotes make the science seem more human, because it's really human beings who are doing the science in the lab, and that human element, we'd like to bring that in. Anything, again, the storytelling elements, paradox, irony, surprise. You were surprised by the finding. When you're writing an article about research that's just come out, it's typical for an independent magazine to have the science journalist interview someone who was involved in the study, but also interview someone who wasn't involved in the study, just to give it outside perspective. So another thing that might happen is you might get contacted by an independent journalist who might ask you, can you comment on a peer's research? And again, just be a little careful, because if you give very laudatory praise or very critical criticisms, those things are likely to make it in the article. It's controversy or colorful prose. So here's one, just a quote that from something that I was writing about a long time ago. But she said, to suggest to people, she was commenting on her peers' work, to suggest to people that you can maintain average sleep times of 6 hours and then drive your truck is just criminal. And so, of course, that quote made it in the article because it was, it was a compelling quote. But you want to be careful about that if you didn't want to say something is criminal, right?
Dr. Sanani.
Yeah.
Yes, we have a question from the audience. You mentioning a few specific cases here about talking about how research affects people and giving advice to the readers. What other advice do you have for people working on fundamental or theoretical research? Some specific examples, perhaps.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, it's harder if you're working on something like, I think of like particle physics is a hard one to write about too sometimes. So one thing is, if you have some analogies or metaphors that help bring the science to life, sometimes when I'm talking to a scientist, they'll have a way of explaining their basic science that's very compelling, and I will often use that in the article. So that's one thing, if you can put it some kind of metaphor or analogy about, to make it, again, more compelling to a wider audience. With very basic research, if you can try to say, well, how might this get used in some kind of technology that would affect humans? Why is this important to understand? And sometimes it's important to understand just for the curiosity factor, and that's okay too. But maybe you saying as the scientist, this is really interesting to me because it's fundamental to the universe, that can be a compelling quote too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, hey, this is going to be related to a cure for cancer, but you showing your own enthusiasm about the science often can get into we can sneak that into an article too and make it sound interesting because you're excited about it as a scientist. So showing your human side, I think, can be very helpful. All right, so another thing to keep in mind when we're interviewing you is that we need direct quotes. So in an article, when I interview a scientist, I will typically try to have 2 or 3 direct quotes from the scientist. And these sound like, oh, they're, when you read them in the article, it seems like they weren't that hard to elicit from the scientist, but actually they can be quite hard to get a direct quote, because a direct quote has to be as the scientist said it. So you have to speak in a complete sentence. And a lot of us sort of meander when we talk, right? We don't necessarily speak in a complete sentence. Or we stick in some jargon in the middle of that sentence, and then I can't use it as a direct quote anymore. It's okay if you add some filler words like ums and reallys and sort of. I'm allowed to delete those, but otherwise I have to be, have fidelity to the quote. So I need you to speak something that I can quote directly. So often when I'm sitting on an interview, I might interview a scientist on the phone or in person for 30, 40 minutes even. I'm waiting. I'm sort of waiting to hear those direct quotes, and I know when I've got them. And so that's part of what we're looking for too. And I'll just give you some examples of quotes that I've used in the past in some of my articles. So this was a quote. He says, "You can't give a child 50 drugs and see which one works, but you can do that with these cells." So this was a basic researcher who was working on cells, but he connected it back to people, to how you might try different treatments in the cells rather than on children. And so that connected it, made it seem more human. And it's also very quotable because there's no jargon in there, right? It's very conversational. Another one that I used once, it says, what's interesting about autism, Sudhoff says, is that the brain is not globally impaired. For example, kids who are unable to speak have normal motor skills. So he was talking about the fact that if you look at autistic kids, a lot of them have social impairments, but they're perfectly, perfectly normal motor skills. And notice that in that little part, what I'm doing there is paraphrasing. And science journalists will often paraphrase you like this. So maybe you can give us a direct quote, but there's a little story or something you explain that we can paraphrase like this, and that might set up a direct quote. So the direct quote here was, you really need a pretty good brain for that. Now, Sudhoff is actually a Nobel Prize winner, and here he is kind of speaking in a nice conversational tone, so it makes him seem human. Before this, people blundered around for 2,000 years trying to decide whether A was better than B. This was an article about statistics and randomized controlled trials, and it's just, again, very conversational, very easy for a layperson to understand, no jargon. This was a story I was doing, it was actually a profile piece, and she gave a little story that's very compelling. So she said on her first day, this was her first day in a PhD program at Yale back in the 1960s, the department head proudly announced that about half of the incoming class of biology graduate students was female, adding, there is no better combination than a male professor with a PhD wife to run his lab. Well, that, story spoke volumes, and that was a really good quote. So again, I sort of set up the story, and then I've got the direct quote. Statisticians are very good at thinking about how bad their conclusions are. That's a nice quote. Or I've been telling people that the really sexy job in the 2010s is to be a statistician, because they're the people who can make the data tell a story, and everybody has data. So again, very quotable, conversational, no jargon. And then this was an article I was doing where I was trying to get some advice for readers. So the scientist said, way before you get enough sun to get a sunburn, you've damaged your DNA. So this is giving advice for readers. All of those are very quotable, but it takes a while in talking to scientists to get those direct quotes, those sentences that are nicely formatted, that are complete sentences, no jargon slipped in, no tangents that you've gone off on. And unfortunately, science has a fair amount of trouble with jargon. And so, for example, when you talk, you may not hear all the jargon that you use because you are so immersed in your science that this is just the way you talk. And so I teach a summer course at Stanford that is for postdocs and PhD students who are thinking about going into careers in science communication. And their final assignment is always to write an article for the lay public. And they are trying very hard to write for a general audience. My co-instructor and I, we go through their articles and we highlight all of the times where they use jargon, and they're surprised by, they don't recognize this as jargon anymore. So this is just one example where the scientist was writing about prions. He's trying to write for a lay audience, but a lot of that jargon is slipping in, just kind of, it's just the way he talks. So gain of function proton, aberrant process, confined to the space of disease. None of these words are really hard words. Like if you ask maybe stochastically, a lay audience wouldn't know what that is, or confirmation, but a lot of these words are familiar to a lay audience, but just not in the way they're used here. So be very careful and think about how much jargon you're using and catch yourself on that. Typical interview questions that you might get. So just to give you a sense of what to expect. We're generally, if we have a specific question on a specific technical element of the science, we will usually ask you that. We generally don't need you to necessarily walk us through every detail of the science. We're looking for more big picture. So we might ask something like, what findings surprised or interested you most and why? That question is designed to be a little open-ended, to elicit the kind of storytelling that we talked about earlier, to get you to say something that's a little human and about what you connected with the science. We also need to say, what's the big picture significance of the work? So we might ask you that directly, or who will benefit from this work? Again, tying back to humans. Were you surprised by the results? We like, that's storytelling, right? The surprise. What made you look into this question? What's the history of this research question? We'll tend to ask something at the end, like, is there anything you want to add? And that gives you an opportunity to tell the journalist additional things that you want to add and you would like them to know about with regards to your science. So a lot of open-ended questions, which makes it very easy for you to get in some good talking points and some good direct quotes. So your job as the interviewee is to be prepared. And I actually recommend that you come up with some talking points. Like I just showed you, a lot of those questions are very open-ended. And so it gives you the opportunity to have something prepared where you say what the big picture take-home message of the research is, or how you might connect this to humans. And it's okay to prepare those ahead of time. So we're looking for those direct quotes. And so sometimes having a few sentences written down that you can tell us, it can be helpful, especially if you're feeling a little nervous about the interview. Have a few things written down. When we ask those open-ended questions, to go ahead and say that whole sentence. We can use that as a direct quote. You always want to ask the journalist before the interview, who is your audience? The audience really does matter. When we talk about the lay public or a general audience, that can mean a lot of things. So I wrote for this beauty magazine for a decade. The target audience there was an extremely general audience. And it was more like, okay, picture somebody who's reading a magazine on the beach. We want to keep it really easy, light, no jargon, not too many technical details. I also wrote for a decade for a magazine called Biomedical Computation Review. This was also for a general audience. It's supposed to be readable by anyone, but we were allowed to ask a lot more technical questions. And obviously the readership for that magazine was much more technical. So I would tell people I was interviewing that it was okay to use a little bit more technical jargon and get into some of those nitty-gritty scientific details for that audience. Again, avoid jargon. Think about, in journalism school, you're told, pretend that you are talking to your grandmother. I think maybe that's a slide on grandmother, so I'd say, pretend that you're talking to your aunt, uncle, grandmother, grandfather. Picture somebody who's smart and educated, but not necessarily interested in science or not necessarily schooled in science. Talk in that way as you talk to them. If there's something in your article that you think could be mucked up by a journalist, that somebody could easily get wrong and that could be misleading to a general audience, anticipate those things and explain them to the journalist. Say, hey, I want to add this, you shouldn't here's the correct way to read that message. Make sure to say what the limitations of the work are. Give that context for journalists so that can slip in. One of the problems with, we have this one study and science journals write about that one study that often feels like you're overselling the science. So give those caveats. And then one thing to really keep in mind is it's important to think about how you present numbers and risk to a journalist. I have worked with some of the most brilliant people who I've ever worked with are journalists, but occasionally journalists will have some phobia on math, even though they're brilliant writers. And so they may not trust themselves to do anything with the numbers themselves. They may just take the numbers that you give them and put them in the article. There are certainly science journalists who are savvy with numbers and might try to interpret those numbers themselves. But a lot of times, whatever number you give to the journalist, that's what's going to end up in the paper. So explaining those numbers or putting them in an easy to understand way can be really important. Don't expect the journalists to do that parsing themselves. And think about that the numbers in your scientific article, the way we present numbers there may not be the best translation for a lay audience. And I'm going to give one example of that in just a minute. Sometimes you're being interviewed for print. Nowadays, it's becoming more and more common to be interviewed for something like a radio interview or a podcast or even a video interview. And so the preparation, I think, for that is a little bit different because they're going to be taking snippets of what you say. And so it's important for a podcast or a radio interview or video interview to actually have practice out loud ahead of time, because we all have speaking tics. We all say and really and sort of. And when I'm doing something for a print article, I can just delete those from your quotes, and that's no problem. I'm allowed to take those out. But in a broadcast, those are going to be preserved because it's just your words. So practice like delivering things and trying to get some of those speaking tics out. Oftentimes, you can ask to see the questions ahead of time for something like this. It's usually a little bit of a longer interview. And you can practice. I do a lot of practice in my car. So when I'm commuting, I actually will practice out loud answering different questions. You don't want to have a script ready. You just want to kind of have practiced out loud the kinds of answers that you might give and practice that delivery. And listen to previous episodes of that podcast or that radio show to get an idea of what they're after, what they like to talk about, what are the types of questions, what's the bent of that particular podcast. That's going to help you to have the right kinds of answers ready and be prepared. All right, so the last thing I just want to talk about here is I want to give a few tips on explaining risk to a journalist or the lay public. And there's a couple of pointers. So one thing to keep in mind is that most people deal with whole numbers more easily than they deal with fractions and percents. So if you can put something into whole numbers, that's also always really helpful. And I'll give a specific example in a minute here. And then be very careful about risk. So if you're doing scientific articles in epidemiology, public health, where we look at relative risks often, hazard ratios, risk ratios, odds ratios. Just keep in mind that though that's a common way to put things in scientific papers, the relative risk can be high even when the absolute risk is low. So it's often much more transparent and easy for a layperson to understand if you put it in absolute risk. So for example, you can have a relative risk of 2, a doubling of risk, when your risk goes from 0.001% to 0.002%. A doubling of risk is also going from 10% to 20%. Those are both a doubling of risk, but they need very different things. So go back to those absolute risks, get those numbers out of the paper and give them to the journalist. And I'll just give one case study. So I happened to be working as an intern at Science News back in 2002. And there was a study that was going on called the Women's Health Initiative. And this study was a big deal. It was a large randomized double-blind study of postmenopausal hormones versus placebo. And back in the 1990s, when I was doing my PhD, the dogma of the day was that postmenopausal hormones protect women against heart disease. Well, this was a randomized trial testing that hypothesis, and it turned out to be just the opposite, that when they actually did an interim analysis and looked at the data early, in fact, there was an increase in heart disease in the women taking hormones. And this was a big deal because there were about 14 million women in the US who were taking those hormones at the time the study was halted. They actually halted the study early. So I was working as a journalist and I received the press release about the fact that they were halting the study early. This could have scared a lot of women because there were a lot of women taking hormones at the time. But I was incredibly impressed with whoever did the press release for this study because they did a really good job of dealing with explaining the risks. So if you look at the scientific paper, they calculated relative risk. So you had a 26% increase in the risk of breast cancer and a 29% increase in the risk of heart disease if you were taking hormones. That's a valid number, but maybe not the best number to present to a lay public that is full of women taking these hormones, because those numbers sound scary. If you look at the absolute risks, though, the absolute risks are much more moderate. So women on hormones had a 0.38% risk per year of getting breast cancer. Those on placebo is 0.3% per year. So the increase in risk if you took hormones was 0.08% per year. For heart disease, it was similarly 0.07% per year. So those don't sound as scary. Of course, these are in decimals and percents, which confuse people. So you can do one step better. And what they did in the press release was they presented absolute risks in whole numbers. So here's what they actually presented in the press release. They said women on hormones, 38 per 10,000 women per year got breast cancer versus 30 per 10,000 women per year in the placebo group. In other words, if you take hormones, you have an 8 out of 10,000 increased risk of breast cancer. That sounds much less scary, and it's similar numbers for heart disease. And that's understandable for a general audience. So because they put that in the press release, all the media coverage that study got put the numbers this way. They did not put the numbers in terms of the relative risk, which I think was really important for the public, actually. So the best translation for the public is not the relative risks here, but those absolute risks presented in whole numbers. And I'll just end here by noting that if you want more training about communicating not only your science to general audiences, but also how to write a scientific article and how to write clearly, I have a whole course on this on Coursera where I do talk more about how to write for general audiences as well as how to write for scientific audiences. And I will stop there and open it up for questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Dr. Sinani. We read so much science journalism, and it's fun to learn more about the thinking behind it and how those kinds of articles are put together. So I have a question. Early on, you mentioned that sometimes reporters will reach out to you directly. They don't want to go through maybe a communication manager. What if we've never heard of someone, a reporter who reaches out to us or their publication? What kind of due diligence should we do before we say yes?
We know, a good question, yeah.
Yeah, we know that we're going to be seen as representing Stanford and not just ourselves. So are there common pitfalls?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because there's the traditional media that we're all familiar with, the traditional magazines and newspapers. But yeah, you might get reached out to by somebody who writes their own blog or some kind of independent media. So you do want to be careful to make sure that it is a reputable outlet and that this is a reputable person. You can Google around, and I think if you read past issues, you read the past blog posts, you can get a sense of what the person is about. If you have questions, this might be a good time to reach out to your communications officer, your public information officer, and say, hey, can you tell me if this publication is something that I want to be involved in? Because you want to be a little careful if it's something that has a political bent, for example, that you don't get sucked into writing or to, providing an interview with the wrong type of journalist. So it is good to be cautious in this day and age. And this is where communication specialists at your university can help.
Great, thanks. We have another audience question. So you mentioned practicing talking out loud before you do, say, a radio interview or podcast. Is it okay to ask a radio host a list of questions in advance?
Absolutely, yes. So yeah, you can ask for the questions ahead of time. They will often provide that because they want you to be prepared. They don't want you to have a lot of ums and reallys and kind of wandering. So they want you to be prepared. So they will often be happy to provide that list of questions or a general list of questions. Here's the things we might ask. And they don't necessarily want it to be scripted, so they may go off of that a little bit. But you can certainly ask for that ahead of time. And my experience that most of them will provide that for you. I also recommend listening to past episodes. So I've done a few podcasts, and how did I prepare? I went and listened to some past episodes. So I got the gist of what is this podcast about? Who's their audience? What are they after? Because everyone is slightly different. They have a slightly different audience. They have a slightly different bent. And sort of understanding that ahead of time can help you answer the questions in the right way. So it is good to do your homework on those.
Kristen, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about how you made the switch from being a scientist and what made you decide you wanted to write about it, and what made that compelling for you to change and switch careers?
Yeah, I mean, so as I think I figured out very early on that I don't necessarily like doing science. So I worked in a wet lab as an undergraduate, and I figured out I don't like pipetting cells, and that's why I moved to epidemiology and statistics, because I realized I might like more working on things that have to do with people. When I got to the epidemiology and statistics part of things, I realized I liked the statistics part the best, because that didn't involve actually doing studies. That means somebody else did the study and I got to play with their data. And so when I was getting ready to graduate, the other thing that I found out that I enjoyed in the course of my PhD is I ran a study. I didn't really enjoy running this study, but one of the parts that we did is to keep participants engaged. We wrote a newsletter, and I found that I had much more fun on the newsletter and analyzing the data than I did on like recruiting participants and writing IRB protocols. So it was clear to me that I wanted to do something that was more on the side of science, where you get to write about it and you get to see the results, and not necessarily the doing, the designing and collecting data part. And so, and I had, for various reasons, didn't necessarily like the environment of academia. So I had decided that this, since I liked writing, I was going to go do science journalism. And the program at UC Santa Cruz is there. And so I knew about it. And so I decided to make that switch. And of course, somehow found myself back in academia, but was fully intending to get out and just be a full-time science journalist. So I do teach a summer course, BIOS 292, for postdocs and PhD students, about how to make that transition into either science writing or science publishing. If anybody is interested in learning more about that, every summer we teach that.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have a couple more audience questions. So going back to the idea of practicing for your interview, would you recommend something like interviewing one of your peers or someone in an adjacent field, or posting on your blog or website somewhere as a way to have a conversation about a subject and try to speak to another audience?
Yeah, so I think the question is, they're asking if you should maybe practice with a peer before an interview with a journalist. Is that am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think so. So both practicing with a peer and posting on a website, a written version.
Ah, okay.
Would recommend both of those practices.
Yeah, I mean, certainly anything you can do to practice, especially if it's your first time doing an interview. If you could have a peer interview you, preferably somebody who's not in your lab, That is somebody who's maybe in a different discipline than you. So I teach a scientific writing course at Stanford, and one of my favorite things to do is I sometimes will get people from very different disciplines, so physicists and biologists, and I have them read each other's work, and they are ultimately extremely surprised at what the biologist doesn't know and the physicist and what the physicist doesn't know. So I remember having one conversation between a biologist and a physicist. The biologist was completely surprised that this smart physicist didn't understand how DNA worked, and the physicist was completely surprised that the biologist had no idea what a neutrino was. And I remember that conversation very vividly because it was sort of like a light bulb went on for both of them. It's like, oh wait, not everybody knows these things. And this was other scientists, but so practicing with somebody, another scientist, or even somebody outside of science, to get that feedback of like, wait, I don't know what that is. You gotta slow down. It can be really helpful. Writing out some answers ahead of time can be helpful if you want, again, to make sure you have some things that are directly quotable. Yeah, preparation is good.
We have somebody ask, I took a health communication class last year, and they were saying the average scientific literacy in the US is about a 7th grade level. So would you want to take your writing down to that level, and how would you do so and still communicate the message?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds about right. And so if you're talking about writing yourself, like not necessarily just talking with a journalist, but if you want to write about your science yourself for a general audience, the way I like to describe what a science journalist does in writing the science, there's a perception out there that what science journalists do is they dumb down the science, which is not an accurate perception. So what I view as a science journalist's job, much of the job is, I kind of view the science as a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, it's like an upside down pyramid. At the very top, there's like the take home message, the big picture, what was the main finding of the study. And then below that, you have some details about what was the type of study. Was it randomized? Was it not randomized? Some kind of second level details. And then below that, you have maybe third level details. What was the sample size of the study? And then you get to like the fourth level details, which is like we used a t-test to analyze the data, and things that are not going to mean anything to a general audience. So a lot of the job of the science journalist is to kind of prioritize what are the details that mean something to somebody who has a 7th grade science education, and what are the details that are just getting into nitty-gritty things. We just sort of chop the story and chop out those lower level details. I don't view that at all as dumbing down the science. What I view that as is being very accurate to the science, but not giving the level of precision that you would usually give for a scientific article. And this is hard for scientists to do because we're used to wanting to be really, really precise. And that's appropriate for a scientific article, but that level of precision won't mean anything to a general audience. So you've got to keep in mind that a lot of the job of writing for a general audience is figuring out what are those details that just aren't going to give, like you'd say a t-test, that doesn't mean anything for a general audience, so it doesn't help them to understand the science. So being a little less precise, but still preserving accuracy is really the trick of doing a good science writing article, and that takes a lot of practice, actually.
Hey, thanks. So one more question. We talked a lot about what happens when a journalist reaches out to you, but what about in the cases where scientists would want to reach out to the journalists? So what suggestions do you have for how to choose the right media, and also when might that be something that you would want to do?
That's a great question. Science journalists love it if you reach out to them. If you've got a scientific article coming out that you think might be of interest to a particular outlet, yes, absolutely reach out to them. They may or may not want to write about it, and because something that you find super exciting may not actually be quite right for their audience. But science journalists want to scoop things. So if you reach out to us, maybe something that's not in Science or Nature and isn't going to get a press release, but might be of interest to a particular publication, yeah, go ahead and reach out to the science journalist. Part of a science journalist's job is actually to cultivate relationships with scientists to get those early scoops. Here's something that's coming up that might be of interest to your audience, and maybe you're the only journalist to write about it. That's something a journalist wants. So you can just send them an email. You can figure out who writes for that publication. Maybe they've interviewed you before for the publication. Keep their name and then reach out to them. And they may say, hey, this isn't right for us, and that's fine. But science journalists are very interested in you letting us know ahead of time when something's coming out. The other thing I'll say, people get confused by embargoes. So journals have embargoes, and you might think it's not okay to reach out to the science journalist. It's actually fine for you to reach out to us and say, hey, I've got a paper coming out in 2 weeks. you might be interested in this. As long the science journalist will obey those embargoes and will not publish about that. You just let them know the embargo. So it's perfectly fine to talk with them ahead of time before the embargo is lifted. That's how all news articles are written. They're written prior to the embargo. That's why they all release at the moment the embargo is over.
Kristen, let me ask you a final question here as we're coming up to our time. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about writing or presenting your information based upon if it's a blog or it's an Instagram post or it's some other way of communicating? There are all these channels now, all these ways to get out information. How do you think about producing content across those media for the same kind of information?
That is a great question. All of those media do have different ways of writing. So I do most of my writing for straight, magazine, straight written news story, feature story, and that's my primary medium. But if I were to take something and translate it to a blog, what makes it a blog? Well, a blog is that it's personal. Suddenly I'm in the story. So it's very common for a communications person at Stanford to write a piece that's a straight news story, take that piece and then turn it into a blog where they bring themselves into it. I talked with the scientist and here's what I found out. It's much more conversational, much more personal. And then to take that same one and put it in a tweet, right? So that it gets coverage across many media. Obviously a tweet is going to be much shorter and you have to capture the essence really quickly. Those are all different styles of writing and they all take practice. Even doing good tweets, it takes practice to actually be able to compact in a single something very compelling in 280 characters that touches people's eye. You probably want to put a picture with that, which is not necessarily something you worry about as much for a straight news story. So it's really important to think about all those different types of media and to try them out and to be able to be fluent in as many as possible. I'm still learning Twitter.
Thank you very much. Kristen, this has been very helpful, and I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And you've told us you were teaching your course in the summer. Did you teach it this summer online?
We did teach it online this summer, yes, which is very interesting. We did synchronous lectures, not asynchronous, and I learned a lot about that.
Excellent. And if any of the students want to reach out to you, can they find you in Stanford Profiles or Stanford Who?
I am kcobb, KCOBB at stanford.edu, and feel free to send me an email if you have questions about careers in science communication or anything we talked about today. I'm always happy to chat about science writing.
Great. All right, thank you all. We'll close this session now and stop the recording. Thank you for joining us for this session of GearUp for Research Communication, brought to you by Stanford Science and Engineering Libraries and the Lane Medical Library. I'm Julie Sweetkind-Singer, the Associate University Librarian for Science and Engineering Libraries. I'm your host for this morning's session. The theme of our event this year is research communication. At this event, individuals from across campus will share effective methods and unique ideas for communicating the meaning and significance of research. We hope you will take away some ideas on how to amplify your research impact. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the GearUp website after the event. If you have a question for the speakers, please type your question in the Q&A box. Your question will be read out by the chat moderator. The chat feature is open and will be used during this session, but we'll be not responding to questions you placed in the chat unless the questions are posed by Helen and Janae. At the end of the talk, we will post a link where you can suggest topics for our future events. Thank you for attending. So our session today is called Creating an Online Portfolio to Communicate Your Research Story. It's hosted by Dr. Helen Chen, who's a research scientist at the Designing Education Lab in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. She is a co-author of Documenting Learning with ePortfolios. Dr. Janae Cohen is Academic Technology Specialist for the program in Writing and Rhetoric. She develops and implements effective ways to teach with technology in the context of writing classes. Welcome, Helen and Janae. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much for having us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you can see our slide deck. So there it is, full screen. All right. And I've also put the link to the slide deck in the chat. So I always like to call slide decks that I work on with Helen our party favors at the end of our time together. So think of this as like your goodie bag that you can explore outside of the shared time today if you want to continue thinking about some of these ideas. So again, thank you for having us. Thank you for the introduction, Julie. I'm Janae Cohn, and I'll be giving the floor over to my colleague Helen Chen in a moment. And we are part of the Stanford Integrative Learning Portfolio Lab. So we're part of a team with other professionals in the student affairs and undergraduate education and graduate education, hoping to support students in telling their stories online. So as part of this conversation today, we're going to be sort of talking in 4 parts. We're going to talk about why you might want to build a portfolio, right? What is an e-portfolio? How might you consider your audience and purpose for communicating your research in this portfolio? We'll then move into some examples of what portfolios actually look like. So we're going to be examining a ton of really great examples of researchers who've created really excellent portfolios in the field. We'll talk about some ways that you can build a portfolio. So what are some steps you can take, some strategies you might use, and then we'll talk about some next steps. But don't worry, we're going to take a few breaks in between for you to be doing some thinking for yourself about your own research story and what that means to you. So I'm going to pass off to Helen to talk a little bit about why you might want to create an e-portfolio. Go ahead, Helen.
Great. Thank you so much, Janae. Again, welcome everyone. We're so delighted that you guys have decided to join us here today. If we go to the next slide, where we want to kind of frame this is thinking about yourself as the researcher, whether you're early on in your career as a grad research assistant or a faculty PI, you certainly have this professional identity that you're developing as a researcher in your field. Now, if we look at the next slide, there is, of course, the research that you actually do, the research questions that you're trying to explore, your research agenda. But together, and where we see in the middle of this Venn diagram, as noted in the next slide, is really your research story. How the combination of who you are as a professional who is advocating for your work, and then the work that you're actually doing, your contributions to the field, how you bring your field to a broader audience, it really represents your research story. And as we heard from the previous speaker, you know, how you communicate with various stakeholders, whether it's the press, future collaborators, potential funders, and so on, how your research might be informing policy. This is where sort of the overlap, the research story becomes very important. And then what are the tools that are available to you to help you tell that story? So if we go to the next slide, the process of creating your research story can certainly allow you to reflect on your experiences and aspirations by, first of all, knowing yourself and really having a sense of, you know, alignment and consistency between the kind of story that you're trying to convey, as well as perhaps your own personal goals and values. And that's where that authenticity comes in, that it's not just intended to be just a marketing tool. Certainly the ability to synthesize or communicate, and the next bullet talks about, you know, how you document that intellectual trajectory. You know, here, you know, of course at Stanford, you're all in the process of growing and changing, evolving and becoming a researcher in your particular field, and how do you represent that? Understanding the needs of different audiences, again, whether it be collaborators, recruiters, students that you may be working with either now or in the future. The next bullet really talks about responding to, you know, those questions about, tell me about yourself, or what do you do, you know, and giving some thought to like how you might tell that story and having some opportunities to practice that. And that really is the final point. How do you practice communicating your story? How might others tell your story? And that's certainly where the next, the networking piece comes in too. So if we keep on going a little bit, Janae, the last part, practicing communicating your story, and then the next bullet, the final bullet, how might others tell your story? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Janae again to talk about what's different as we think of, especially now, working in the digital space.
Right. So we're probably all used to networking in some capacity in person. And so we may have had some practice connecting with people in our field, whether that's at conferences or for sort of more informal connections in professional spaces, where you might be really used to telling your story in a certain way. You might have some really clear expectations and norms around what it means to, you know, be at a poster session, have someone come up to you and talk to you about some of your ideas. And that typically happens kind of through one channel when you're in person. It's usually through speaking, right? Using that kind of oral communication skills to really connect with someone. And you get that immediate, responsive sort of feedback from that person who you're talking to in real time, or what we might also call synchronous time. And when you're in person, you always know who you're talking to, right? You've got this one-to-one exchange where you're exchanging ideas in real time. But when you start to think about how you might tell your story in a digital space, you can't really just tell your story in the same way that you might in a face-to-face dialogue. You really have to show what your story looks like because you have multiple channels to communicate your ideas. So you have to think about, how do I use visuals to show my story? How do I use the placement of text in different places to show my story? How might I incorporate video clips to show my story? In other words, you're dealing with different kinds of expectations and norms around communication practices. So just as you thought of in the last session, some ways to think about social media and how those expectations might shape what you produce, similarly, when you're creating a portfolio, you want to think about, what do I expect to see on a website from someone? And how might the norms of what I encounter on other people's websites, how might those shape what I'm communicating? A challenge, of course, is that digital communication is kind of static, right? You're not going to receive immediate response from your viewers. You're communicating with them outside of real time. People could be looking at your portfolio whenever. So you don't get to control the communication or be as flexible in your response. So you'll have to plan a little bit more. That's part of what we're going to be talking about in this conversation today. How can you plan for how to show that story to anticipate the range of audiences that might encounter your work? Because you don't really ultimately know exactly who your audience is going to be. It could be someone Googling your name. It could be someone who read a paper that you wrote. It could be someone who found your email, your website in your signature link or from your LinkedIn or Twitter profile, right? So you'll want to be capacious in your imagining of who you primarily want to reach and what that's going to look like. So we want to give you a minute here to reflect a little on your purpose and audience for building a portfolio. So maybe you're here today because you're really excited about the idea of building a portfolio. Maybe you're here because you're just kind of curious, like, oh, I don't know, maybe I want to make this. So we want you to think a little bit for about 2 minutes, so it's really fast, about why do you want to have an online portfolio? So what's the purpose for you? What are you trying to accomplish in telling your story in this sort of asynchronous, multimodal or multi-channel kind of way? And then who do you want to hear your story, right? The different audiences for your portfolio are going to have different sets of needs. So for many of you trying to communicate research, I suspect that most of your primary audiences might be prospective employers, academic search committees, or funders for your research. But it's possible that you might also want to reach some of your peers or your research collaborators, or just kind of your general network of people that you work with, right? You may also want to think about your digital audience at large, right? Maybe how do you want to communicate your research to the public or to friends and family? And what story do you want them to take away from that? We're going to talk more about what experiences can illustrate that story in a little bit. But what we'd like you to do in the chat now is go ahead and share. So if you click the chat button, you will want to, under the To section, actually click the drop-down menu to all panelists and attendees. That way everyone can see your responses, not just the panelists, people in panelist roles, but everyone who's here today. Go ahead and click that drop-down the menu to select all panelists and attendees. And if you're willing to share, right, what do you see as your audience? And what would you identify as the purpose of a portfolio as you think about maybe the potential of creating one? So I will be silent for just a minute here while we give people a chance to locate the chat and think a bit about sharing purpose and audience. I will say one reason we were asking some of you to share this today is it's really helpful in these kind of events to use your real examples to help us illustrate how we might align the design of a portfolio with your authentic purposes and audiences. Helen and I can imagine a bunch of different purposes and audiences, and we will draw upon some real examples, but it adds a little extra something, I think, to draw upon who's in the room and what you're wanting to bring to this work today. So just take about a minute here to wait for some of those responses to come in. Great. So seeing Philip and Bianca have contributed. So, Philip is thinking about kind of who we've listed as primary audiences as well. So you think about prospectors, employers, funders, and peers. Right, so I love that Philip's thinking about how he might reach a broader range of people out there other than just people at Stanford. Bianca's thinking, I think it sounds like a bit about how she wants to reach her peers and maybe how she wants to use the portfolio to find future collaborators. That's great. So Merritt's talking about increasing visibility in the field. Absolutely, right? That's similar to some Philip's goals. And Zhenbo is thinking about recruiting graduate students or employees. So nice, we're having some people who are, it sounds like Zhenbo's thinking about, so people think both about Stanford, how to bring people to Stanford, but we're also thinking about going outside of Stanford. That's great. Right, so Jamie's talking about building connection, community, exchanging ideas.
And I think this, what you're seeing here is, and I know there was a previous panel on using social media, when we talk about that sort of visibility, for example, like with science, Twitter, and all of that, how does a portfolio fit into your digital ecosystem? I mean, it is just one tool of the tools that are available to you that you can use to, whether it's to increase visibility or to reach out to potential collaborators and so on. I really appreciate, Philip, your comment about, people who are not, around the world. And what are the considerations there? And so you're not just building a reputation in particularly your field specifically, but also thinking about the global context in terms of where a portfolio might fit in.
Yeah, exactly. And I love this suggestion from Abhijit here too, or Abhijit. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, Abhijit. Let me know if you could put a phonetic pronunciation so I can get it right. But archive of small projects, right? So to Helen's point about the digital ecosystem, right? This might be a place to incorporate some of those pieces that might not otherwise fit in your digital ecosystem, right? So if you haven't been able to publish them in peer-reviewed journals, or if you haven't been able to, or if you can't just like tweet about it, if it doesn't fit into a tweet, and you need kind of a space to communicate it more creatively, that can be a great way to do this work as well. I think for the purposes of time, we are going to move along here to talk a little bit about some of the, how you might consider some of your experiences to align with the purpose and audience that you have shared for today, right? So to take us kind of one step back from this, right? Your abilities to communicate those purposes that many of you shared in the chat, or reach those audiences that you shared in the chat, those purposes and audience goals will be even more impactful when you can think about how you resonate with audiences both intellectually and emotionally. This is a quote from Professor Jennifer Ocker, who's in the Graduate School of Business, right? So we want to think about when you share your research for your audiences, how do you tell that story in a way that's not just the raw data, that's not just the results, but how do you tell it as a story to bring in the kind of human connection that'll help people really understand the impact and the meaning of your research? So we're going to give you a tool here that we're not actually going to fill out in real time. So this is part of your goodie bag of resources. But one exercise that we suggest doing to help you think about the experiences that might help you humanize your research is this is a chart that we call a building blocks chart. And you might think about picking 3 experiences as a researcher, right? These might be defining moments in your research that are meaningful to you and your field. These might be experiences where you used an especially valuable research skill. These might be activities that you consider a highlight of your time here at Stanford, right? So for the individual who's trying to recruit Stanford students or postdocs, this last bullet point might be especially helpful, right? To kind of think about a recruitment mission, whereas these first 2 kinds of experiences might be more helpful to brainstorm if you're trying to share your own work or disseminate your own ideas for future employers. Try to isolate those experiences to really focus on a prioritized number of stories that you want to tell. And the rest of this chart is inviting you to think about some details that might help you, again, make that experience even richer, even more humanized, right? So you might think about what your experiences are and then try to describe them. That description you could use through some storytelling strategies, which we'll get to in just a minute. But you might think about what kinds of values were activated for you as a researcher in that experience. Again, what kind of skills did you practice? And then when we say evidence, how can you show that you had that experience, right? So what are things that you've produced or what are things that you've done that might show that that experience actually happened, right? So the description is one thing, but it's also valuable to scaffold that with pieces of information like your publications or photos of you in the lab or a copy of a poster from your research session. What are things that might illustrate the meaningful experiences for you? So this exercise seems meaningful for you. We've actually put this building blocks worksheet into a Google Doc that you can copy and then put into your own Google Drive account. So I'll put the link for that in the chat right now. Again, you can kind of be thinking about this as we go. We're not going to take a pause to give you time to fill it out right now, but it can just be a nice tool to get you started if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with trying to map out those experiences to tell your story and illustrate your purpose that you're trying to communicate to your audience. So Helen's going to give us a little bit more detail here about how you might detail evidence in particular, right? So once you start to brainstorm those experiences, what does it look like to, on your portfolio, show evidence of those experiences? Helen's going to talk us through that now.
So yeah, so one of the rows on there is evidence, and it's this idea of how do we take advantage of the portfolio, the e-portfolio medium, right? So the fact that it's an e-portfolio or professional website, how do you take advantage of that? Now, unlike something like LinkedIn, where it is sort of this standardized, format, the portfolio is set up where you can really decide what experiences you want to highlight and how you want to represent them. So we talk about this idea of artifacts being examples of exemplary work, projects, papers. This idea of going to a conference and someone says, well, can I get a copy of your slides, or where can I learn more about your research? Instead of just sending them, let's say, a couple of PDF attachments of papers, which inevitably end up in everyone's email as this list of things that I always mean to go back to but never get a chance to. The idea that you could point them to your website, point them to your portfolio, and there they can not only, find the information that they're requesting, but also learn more about everything else that you do, have all of your contact information in case they want to reach out and learn more. Another place where a portfolio link could be helpful to include is in the email signature that you might have, that it's very easy to find. Sometimes we see people link to their LinkedIn profiles or even Twitter handles, or possibly, again, a link to a professional portfolio or website. In this case, with the idea of other kinds of examples, whether they be research papers, teaching moments, other kinds of, teaching evaluations, those would be things that you could potentially include, but also take into consideration the different kinds of formats. You can include multimedia, whether it's pictures or images, videos, keywords, quotations, and so on, as examples of how these artifacts and different kinds of artifacts can be helpful. If we go to the next slide, though, it's more than just having a list of things or just kind of including a bunch of photos. It's not really intended to be a scrapbook or anything like that. The question is, and this is where the reflection piece comes in, is how do you create meaning for that artifact? The importance of the experience, what impact did it have? Now, one example I would give is, certainly we all have our list of publications, and certainly you could copy and paste your list of publications from your CV and put it on a website. But the question is, what additional value could you reveal about, for example, even though you may be the third author in a list of authors, what contribution did you make? What did you do? Like in terms of, were you managing the project, doing particular data analysis or procedures and so on? That's where you have an opportunity to not just include the abstract of the paper, but also perhaps more information about your specific contribution. So in this example here from Sarah Brennan, a graduate student, she kind of gave an overview of the course that she took at Stanford, but then really specifically highlighted the skills that she got out of that particular course. So again, the opportunity here with evidence is to really demonstrate how an artifact, together with this meaning, really contribute and relate to your overall story. So if we go to the next slide, then I think we're going to actually now move into storytelling strategies. As we go on, and I know we're going through this fairly quickly, please feel free to use the Q&A to ask any questions that you might have as they come up. Now, this idea of, thinking about where do I begin? How do I start thinking about how I want to tell my digital story? We actually have a list of about 7 examples of different story strategies, and most of them are listed in this paper here, which we'll include a link to in the slide deck. But I'm going to focus on 3 digital story strategies, which just could be some examples of how you might get started. So if we go to the first one, which is external empathy, internal story, this is one of my favorites, mainly because it's an opportunity to help people perhaps relate or understand, your research. If someone asks you that question, what do you do? How do you even begin? Especially if it's someone who's not in your field, or if it's someone who's in your department, but maybe still doesn't have a particular understanding of what you specifically do, still explain in a way that they can relate to is important. So external empathy really begins with this idea of asking a question. In this case, do you remember the last time your cell phone battery lasted you throughout the week? Of course, many of us would say no, but immediately it creates that connection. Here's a common problem that we all have, or a common need that we all have. And this graduate student in chemistry, then after kind of building that empathy, that shared experience, then dives into the internal story of talking about how his research focuses on the processes that make batteries lose capacity over time. This is where the more specific jargon or specific, concepts or principles can come in. Rather than starting with that first, you're sort of flipping it, right? Starting with an experience that most people can relate to. Now, in the next slide is another example. Kate Lindsay was a PhD student in linguistics here at Stanford, and now she's a assistant professor of linguistics at Boston University. She studied languages, and starts off with this sort of brief intro of, hello, did you know that in Edi, a language spoken in Papua New Guinea, there are different words for hello depending on the distance between the two speakers. And so again, presenting a scenario where, that people can relate to before going into the very technical and detailed aspects of her research in Papua New Guinea, studying linguistics and taxonomies and so on. So the second story strategy that I want to share is one that many of you may have heard, and know of, this idea of telling your story in 6 words. Whether it's kind of hearkening after Hemingway's, iconic 6-word story, or this idea of almost like a bumper sticker, is that if you were to kind of think about how you might represent your research story in 6 words, what would that be? And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 6 words, but it's just a way, like, if you were to distill it, really kind of represent its essence, it could be a useful exercise as you think about how you want to communicate your research story, especially online when people are not reading dense paragraphs of text. They are really, as we all know, how we browse the web these days. So in this case, Rachel Tompa, a PhD student in Aero-Astro, talks about engineering easier access to space exploration, has that on the front page of her portfolio. In the next slide, Hannah Wayman-Steele, who is majors in chemical physics and so on, she uses theoretical chemist learning to design RNA. So that really is a combination of who she is as a researcher and then the work that she is doing and so on. And this is a portfolio, again, we won't go into tools too much, but this is a portfolio that she built in GitHub and was then able to incorporate code and all of that. Now, the third strategy that I want to briefly go over today is this idea of 3 phrases that you want to be known for. 3 words or phrases that, when you meet someone, let's say at a networking event or sometimes we see this actually on LinkedIn profiles and so on, what are the things that you would want someone to remember, So again, the exercise here would be to think about 3 phrases, 3 words. Why did you choose them? How do these phrases relate to your personal, academic, or professional career aspirations? Now, how we've seen students use them in portfolios, and if we go to the next slide, one would be just 3 dimensions of who they are, 3 representations of, their particular interests. So in this case, Michael Reddick, who is graduated with his PhD in chemical engineering, he talked about his work as a scholar, as an advocate, as well as a leader, and would bring in, his work when in his lab, as well as his leadership, for example, with the Black Engineering Graduate Student Association and so on. So be able to then provide that richer, holistic representation of who he is. So when we look and then at the next slide about like an e-portfolio, then what are the kind of, menu items or, categories of things you could typically include. So oftentimes, of course, there is a home page, perhaps an About Me page. Sometimes experiences are incorporated, together with projects. And perhaps this is an opportunity to bring in, something like side projects or things that don't necessarily fit in other places. Sometimes a link to a resume or CV. And of course, with things like with platforms such as Weebly or WordPress and so on, you can include all of your social media links there as well. So this becomes a hub for what you're doing. Oftentimes for researchers, it is research, teaching, publications, particularly for those students who might be thinking about more academic pathways. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Janae to go to our next activity.
Right, so we want to give you a few minutes, and we say 5 on the slide, but I think we'll make it a little bit more like 3 to 4, just for the purposes of time, so that we have time for kind of more open Q&A at the end too. But we'll give you a couple minutes to try out one of those storytelling strategies that Helen shared. So you have the option to either write a 6-word story about who you are as a researcher and what drives you, or you could write a 6-word story about the value or purpose of your research for, little typo there, but for your primary audience, right? So think about whether the story you want to capture is about you and your work, or whether you want the 6-word story to be about your research itself and what the research is advancing. And I'll give you a third option here out loud, which is if you're feeling really stumped on a 6-word story, you could also think about those 3 words. That might be another way to kind of reflect on one of these strategies too. So we encourage you to take a minute or two to think about what your 6-word story might be about you or about your research. And when you're done, we'd love to see some of your ideas in the chat again. So if you're willing to share, again, the more examples we have, the more we can kind of have to work with, and it's nice to just see more examples to generate more ideas. Feel free to go ahead and share those again under all panelists and attendees in the chat. And while you're doing that, I just want to let you all know I've been receiving some notifications that the deck link is inaccessible for some of you. It's just a visibility setting that I need to switch. So when we get to the formal Q&A period at the end, I'll probably stop sharing for just a second. I'll unlock access so that you will have access to the deck. So no worries, you're going to get access to that in a matter of mere minutes. But for now, we would love to see some of your 6-word stories. So we'll take, about 2 more minutes to let you think about this and share some of your ideas in the chat. All right, Jembo is our first volunteer, holistic approach to treat mental disorders. That's great. I really like that 6-word story because it's very clear, gets us right to the point of what imagining what your research is about. Right, the concept of something being holistic is very legible to a variety of audiences. So awesome, what a great first entry. And that entry could be a great sort of part of starting, your portfolio out to kind of then offer evidence from there. I love this from Karen. Curiosity, questions, and queries. Answers, keep searching. That's so fabulous, right? Because there's a provocation here, right? So there's actually tension in Karen's story. That there's a sense of like, here's what kind of compels Karen, and here's the kind of what motivates Karen to keep going. It's very cool. And there's a provocation for the audience here too, right? Encouraging them to keep searching. That part of her work is to encourage that thinking. That's great.
And I guess one thing I want to, especially looking at Zembo's, this idea of holistic approach to treat mental disorders, that's the kind of thing that really actually could be considered, for your headline on your LinkedIn profile, for example. It's the kind of thing where, it's just enough to kind of learn more about what your field is and so on, but also the whole idea, right? And this is true, like if you're thinking about putting this on your homepage of your portfolio, just enough to get people interested so that they want to learn more. They want to keep scrolling, they want to click to learn more about who you are. So again, you just, not that it has to necessarily be something that you would definitely make it onto your portfolio or website, but is a starting point for you to think about how you want to represent yourself and what you want people to remember about you in sort of the seconds that, let's say, for example, recruiters spend looking at LinkedIn profiles or looking at websites.
Yeah, we've got Frank's here, the joy of making the invisible visible. That's lovely, right? There's something very like, I appreciate that some of these stories are evoking, a little bit of empathy here too, right? Like the curiosity, the excitement, your interest in the topic too, that appeal to emotions and engagement is also really great for this genre and space. To bring in, right, what kind of drives you, what keeps you compelled is also very helpful here.
Okay, but Frank, you got to give us a little more there, because like, what is your field? Like, what are we talking about here? Now I really need to know.
There you go. Object again of cancel out diffusion, study molecules longer, right? So we've got some specificity there about the activity involved in the research. Creative, impactful, supportive learning environment. So Jamie, that's sort of about who she is and the work that she does. These are also awesome. Now you all have to make your portfolios with these stories as your anchor text, right? Because there's a lot we can kind of unpack here and get out of it.
Right.
And leveraging fundamental science for clean energy, right? Another action-oriented story here.
Right. So, another approach to thinking about this, like, and Janae can certainly speak more to this, but this idea of like almost like a thesis, right? Not that this is necessarily your thesis, but something like this, and then what's the evidence that supports this? Or, certainly we want to know, how are you, what is your approach, Jamie, in terms of how you go about creating impactful, supportive learning experiences? And what have you done in the past? What do you hope to do in the future? And so on. So yeah, I know, Janae, you may certainly have additional thoughts about that.
I think that's spot on. That stories can have impact both, right? Describing who you are and what, who you are in the past and present, but it can also help us look ahead to the future. It's hard to pack all that in to one 6-word story, but that, how you craft that thesis statement for your portfolio will also impact the ways that other people read the work that they're going to be encountering and how they're seeing you situated within that timeline of your work. I also acknowledge David's great contribution here, making renewable energy accessible to everyone, and Divya's empowering environment sciences with policy making. Really, there's a lot of potential in all of these stories. I'll emphasize that too, right? So just this exercise alone can get you to be prioritizing and thinking about, how do I focus my portfolio? Since it's going to be hard to capture every single aspect of your entire research work or your entire research career, but that's not the point of it, right? The point is to be that one driving, to Helen's point, thesis statement, purpose statement for what you want to primarily accomplish within this portfolio. So we're going to move along here since we've just got a little under 10 minutes left. Please feel free to keep sharing your story ideas if they do come up for you. But we're going to go ahead and sort of move into sort of thinking about next steps. So if this exercise got you really excited about, hey, what does it actually take to make this portfolio thing? We start by talking a lot about purpose and story and audience, because you really have to have a clear sense of those ideas before you can actually start building a website. But at this point, most people are wondering, okay, who should I be thinking about when I build this website, and then how do I actually do it, right? So I just want to remind you at this juncture, right, that you want to think about who's in your feedback network to give you suggestions on refining this story or refining this purpose, right? So if you got excited about your 6-word story, I would suggest sharing that, right, with someone in your primary audience, right, and say, hey, how would this land for you? How would this feel for you to read or encounter this? And kind of keep iterating to think about how you might most effectively reach the people in your network from whom you normally get feedback, or from whom you would like to be reaching in a more effective way in the future. And as you think about how, there's a few considerations you may want to keep in mind, right? So we've talked a lot about audience already, but at the level of how do you do this, you might want to consider if there's a particular platform that your audience is especially compelled to use, right? Do people in your field tend to publish their personal websites or their work on GitHub, for example? Or are they going to be using more of the kind of commercial site builder platforms like Squarespace or Weebly might be examples you've heard of before? And if there isn't really one platform that people in your field are using, that's totally fine. That gives you more options to consider. But sometimes it's nice to think about how do you work in conversation with what other people are doing or what you've noticed from other people practicing. You also want to be honest with yourself about how comfortable you are with learning a new technology. Building a portfolio, building a website is really time consuming. I'm not going to gloss over that. And it's an ongoing project. It's something you kind of keep returning to and changing at different points in your career. I've had my own portfolio for 8 years now. I have to think about that. And I've made lots of small technical changes over those years. But the platform I chose knowing it would be flexible to this. It's built on a WordPress install, right? So we use WordPress as my content management system for my site. At that time, I was like, well, I know how to use this content management system. I've got some basic HTML and CSS skills, but I'm not a coding whiz. I'm not going to be working from the terminal on this. So I can plug in templates, and I know templates will continue to evolve with this tool. So I wanted something flexible and portable over those years. So that's just something you want to think about. Do you want this portfolio for some short-term purpose? For me, I knew it was going to be a long-term project for me as well. So I chose a platform knowing that I wanted it to be a really long-term solution. Some other considerations around ownership, right? Can you easily export your ePortfolio content or your design? So some of you might care a lot about whether the design is something you've made from scratch. Some of you might not care at all. You might be totally fine with just using a template that some designer at Weebly Core has made for you that you plug your own information into. In most site builder tools, you should be able to export your text pretty easily, but a design is where it gets a little tricky. If, again, you're using someone else's design template or the color palette or the resources, you might not own those things, right? So you have to think about whether that matters to you. You'll also want to think about the value of analytics for you. So do you want to use a site building tool that gives you a really robust analytics dashboard, right? Do you want to know how people are finding your site? Do you want to leverage those analytics to do other kinds of work around your digital identity? Some platforms have really great analytics built in. Granted, for most website tools, you can plug in Google Analytics or other third-party analytics tools as a way to measure traffic. So it's not that your platform entirely dictates your access to analytics. But again, some platforms have it built in. So if you're not especially tech savvy, that might be helpful so you don't have to figure out how to plug in another analytics engine. But if you are tech savvy and want that, that might open up different kinds of options for you. And finally, you want to think about branding on your own site. So most Weebly or Wix or site builder sites by default will have the company's name in the domain name. But you might want to think about having and buying your own domain. So I have janaecohn.net is my website. And I bought that domain a long time ago, and I've kept paying for it over the last several years. It's not very expensive. And I think it's a really good investment because usually things with your own domain name appear higher up in Google search results. So you want to think about again, how much that matters to you, how much you want to make that investment. I'm going to go through this really fast. We just got 3 minutes left, but there are a bunch of different website builders and content management systems you might want to think about. I'll acknowledge for research, there are even some tools that are research specific that are actually built for publishing research, like Scalar and Omeka are examples. I know I have a humanities background, so those are ones I'm kind of personally familiar with. But there may be other platforms like that that maybe your friendly librarians can also help you identify if you're looking for a field-specific research publishing platform. So your choice here about platform might differ depending on whether it's your own personal website just for you, or whether it's a site where you really want to be disseminating your research or research-based ideas. So we want to leave a couple minutes here at the end for questions, but we thank you for your engagement and for sharing your stories and ideas with us today. We encourage you to stay in touch with us. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, Helen and I are part of the Integrative Learning Portfolio Lab, and you can check out our website at eportfolio.stanford.edu to learn a little bit more about our team and the work that we do. We do all kinds of different workshops and events for units and programs across campus. So we'd be pleased to kind of stay in touch. We're also on Twitter, and you can email us if you have further questions. So I haven't seen anything come through the Q&A, but you're welcome to submit a question there for our last couple minutes, or you can also just ask a question in the chat. We're open to that as well. So we'll just see if you have any questions. I'm going to take a moment here. Maybe, Helen, if you wouldn't mind fielding the questions. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so I can make sure the deck has the proper share settings, and I'll reshare that in the chat in just a second.
Great. Thanks, Jen.
That way everyone has access to the deck. Sure.
Great. Thank you so much. I found this really inspiring. I'm busy writing my own catchphrases here. I'm still working on that piece.
Good.
While we're waiting for audience questions, I have a question myself. Is there sort of an ideal length or size to a portfolio? I'm assuming we don't want it to be a dump of everything we've ever worked on. Like how should we be thinking about, what to include and what to exclude?
Right, right. Great question that we get asked a lot by both undergrads and grad students. I think, it really goes back to purpose and audience. What's the purpose of the portfolio and who is the audience that you're trying to reach? Very oftentimes it is easy to think, okay, well, this is going to be a portfolio of everything I've ever done. And because it's the web, I can put as much into it or, as I want and so on. It's sort of limitless and so on. So in that case, is it then more a portfolio for yourself? If you're really documenting your own achievements and work and so on, so that everything is in one place, that is certainly one model or approach. However, if you're thinking about whether you're looking for, let's say, oftentimes we work with students who are thinking about job seeking. And so what might a search committee be looking for? What kinds of materials would I want to make, easily available? Or if I'm thinking that this is something that I might include as I'm, now an assistant professor and I imagine students might be part of the audience that might be looking at this portfolio. So what other things might we include? This is again where, having the different pages that might offer some kind of, multiple different pathways in which to navigate your portfolio. The question is, first of all, then the person who comes to your portfolio, can they find the things that they need to find? Whether it's the presentation that you gave at the GearUp event or, a paper that you published and so on, are they able to easily find it? So that's where I think the user experience piece becomes very important. And certainly that's something that Janae and her work in the program in writing and rhetoric, working with the notation and science and communication program, has really helped students think about and how to navigate. And Janae, I don't know if you want to say a few words about that. Or maybe she's, okay. Well, anyway, so she has some examples of what that might look like. All right, so I see, Karen, we have a question here. Can you talk more about what to include in portfolio for graduate students? Over the last couple of years, we've taught a course called Portfolio to Professional, where we actually do step graduates. It's largely been masters, PhDs, and postdocs, where we do step them through the process of actually creating a portfolio over the course of 10 weeks, meeting only for an hour and 15 minutes each week and so on. So again, purpose, it is for me, I guess I'm going to sound like a broken record, purpose and audience. Are you looking for, is it for career, or are you early on in your grad career and you're looking to kind of begin to build that, professional identity as a graduate student, as a PhD student, as a researcher, and so on. If thinking more academic, we do see the common sort of menu of like, teaching, research, publications, and so on. However, this is an opportunity, and I was really struck by Abhijit when you talked about, other kinds of projects that don't fit, the kind of side projects, how might you include, how and where might you include those? So, again, what to include will really depend on, again, who your intended audience is and what's the purpose. So, Janae, maybe you'll want to say a few words there.
Sure, and I'm sorry that my person has disappeared from Zoom. My internet has gone completely out. So that's really great timing. So anyway, all I'll just kind of add on to that is just that, I'll just reiterate, this is an ongoing kind of reassessment process. So as you're sort of starting to think a little bit about representation in multiple modes and on your portfolio itself, you just sort of want to keep checking in to sort of say, again, what am I trying to accomplish here? How do I sort of prioritize down for that story based on my main goal? And that might just change over time for you. That's how your portfolio will just kind of evolve. And so I would encourage you to be sort of flexible as you're working through this process as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Helen and Janae. I think this was very interesting. I especially enjoyed the fact that you've made some resources available to the people on the call and the people who will watch this in the future so that it can be really concrete for them, and your willingness to have folks reach out to you after this talk. So thank you both very much for participating. We appreciate it very much. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
And now,
thank you for having us.
Oh, sure. We're now going to take a break for about 10 minutes before we start our last session. I would like to encourage any of you who have ideas for what you would like to see us focus on in the future to please do so. And I'll put up a slide that shows the bit.ly link for you to be able to give us ideas for GearUp in the future. And we'll put that in the chat as well. And we'll start again in about 10 minutes. Thanks. I'm your host for this morning's session. The theme of our event this year is research communication. At this event, individuals from across the campus will share effective methods and unique ideas for communicating the meaning and significance of research. We hope you will take away some ideas on how to amplify your research impact. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the GearUp website after the event. If you have a question for the speaker, please type your question in the Q&A box. Your question will be read out by the chat moderator, Linnea. The chat feature is open, but we are not responding to questions placed in the chat window. At the end of the talk, we'll post a link where you can suggest topics for our future events. Thank you all for attending. I'm excited about this session now from 11 to noon because we have a series of lightning talks. The presenters will have about 10 minutes total for their presentation, about 5 or 6 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and transition to the next speaker. So thank you all, thank you to all of our lightning talk speakers for their presentations. We're going to get started right now with Abhijit Lavania talking to us about speaking science. Take it away, Abhijit.
Thanks, Julie. Um, yeah, so hopefully this should be 5 minutes, so I'll have time for questions. So my name is Abhijit Lavanya. I'm a grad student in the Applied Physics department, and I want to talk to you about the Goggles Optional podcast. So, sorry. So what is Goggles Optional? We're a group of Stanford graduate students and postdocs, and we put together a weekly science podcast. In a normal non-COVID year, would put out maybe 40 episodes a year, running around 30 minutes each. We try to provide a professional but humorous take on the week's science news. And to give you an idea of what the scope of that is, we have people from the following departments. So physics, applied physics, the biology departments, the material science, earth system science, and we're happy to have people from other departments join us and expand the range of what we can talk about. So every week we gather together, we look at science news that caught our eye, and we decide what we want to cover as quick headlines. We'll talk about 2 or 3 features on publications that have been put out. We might discuss things that can be broadly thought of as science news and what the impact could be. So for example, in this episode a year and a half ago, one of the features was about the genetics of roses and about a science publication. But that was also the week the Golden State Killer had been identified using genetic information from public databases. And so we talked a little bit about the science of that and what the policies around it were. And then we'll occasionally do interviews with grad students and postdocs about papers that they've published and scientist spotlights and various things like that. So this was a interview. In this episode, one of the things we did was an interview with a postdoc from a Stanford lab. And for one of these stories, so let me take the example of this episode. One of the features we did was about these baby jumping spiders and how they have trade-offs in their vision. We assume that our audience is an educated non-scientist adult. So we don't assume any previous knowledge about the topic. But we assume that because they're listening to us, they are interested in the science. And one of our limitations is that this is an audio-only format. So as scientists, we're used to sometimes communicating with words, written words and pictures. So you can't really go back. You can't use figures to explain things. So you have to go slower and maybe do a little more repetition and avoid jargon more strenuously. And so I was talking on the story, and so I would get together with a writer. We'll maybe read or maybe skim the paper and press releases, and then we'll break down what we want to communicate about it. So for here, we might talk about what are jumping spiders. They have 8 eyes. Why do they need to have that many? What do they use them for hunting? And then we will try to talk about what the physical size of an eye and the number of photoreceptors in there and their size tells us about how good the vision is in terms of darkness and in terms of the small things it can make out. And then we'll talk about the work that happened in the paper. So in this, it was interesting. They had a tiny encephaloscope to look inside the baby spider eyes and what it means for the biology of these papers, or these spiders, sorry. And while doing that, as you might have gathered from our thumbnails and titles, we try to keep this maybe a little bit silly, if appropriate, and include some jokes or choose more memorable analogies. And that's how we put together one of our episodes. Thanks. If you want to listen to us, we're at gogglesoptional.com, or you can find us on iTunes or wherever you find podcasts. If you're interested in talking to us or joining us, you can contact us at our email and our Twitter and Facebook. And thanks, and I'll take questions.
While we're waiting for audience questions, I have a question. What kind of feedback have you gotten from the public about your podcast? Do you have a sense for how many people are listening?
Yeah, so we have, not the most familiar with numbers, but our listenership weekly is, I think, around 300. 400 people. Goes up and down
Mhm.
for different episodes. Um, and we receive some emails from time to time about people who like us, people who have weird problems with the voices of hosts. So some negative, but a bunch of positive ones.
We have a question in the Q&A. How do you choose your topics for the podcast?
Yeah, so we'll keep sharing different stories that catch the eye. So in the whole team, so there might be something on science news websites or in the general news, or a paper that we read that was relevant, and we'll choose things based on well, how interesting we find them, I think personally, in terms of something that we can communicate to everyone. And then in the writers room, people will pitch the fact that they want to talk about it, and so if they can get other people there excited about it, it's fair to say that we can hopefully our audience will also find it interesting.
Cool. We have another audience member who's interested in how you got the podcast started. What inspired you to take on this challenge?
Okay. So I think I should say I didn't actually start this podcast. If you looked at the numbers, we're on episode 330 something. This was started around 6 years ago by a completely different set of people now. Who are interested in creating this kind of thing, um, creating something a little bit funny and a little bit science informative.
Mm-hmm.
Abhijit, do you ever go out and actually read about some research of some Stanford folks and then talk to them about whether or not they'll come on the podcast?
Yes, yes, we do. That was so for we do. Sometimes if we know people, it's easiest for us to get them on. But even if we don't, uh, sometimes we'll reach out. So for example, with Dr. Ryan Korchis, we knew someone in his lab, and so we were interested in talking to him. Usually we'll talk to the postdocs or the grad students, not the PIs.
So even if you didn't start, just to follow up to the last question, if you didn't start the podcast, what inspired you to become involved? This seems like it's probably a lot of hours.
Well, it's split up because we have a larger team, but we try to every year put on a live show, and I went to the live show, and I found it very interesting, and I learned some extremely weird science that I'd never learned before, and so I decided I wanted to be part of it.
We have a question kind of similar to that. So did you have experience before you started with this podcast, or have you learned everything on the job? And how did you prepare yourself for hosting a podcast?
I don't think any of us had right now had previous experience with something like this. So people usually start working. They start writing things, and then as they get more comfortable, they move to actually speaking on air.
Great, thank you, Abhijit. This is really interesting. I didn't know about your podcast, but I'm going to start listening to it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have you stop sharing, and we're going to turn it over to Krishna Rao, and Krishna is going to talk about using apps to make results interactive. Thanks for joining us, Krishna.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for that introduction. I'm a PhD student in Earth System Science working in the Remote Sensing Eco-Hydrology group. And today I'll be talking about how we can use apps to make our results interactive. But before we delve into the how, let me talk a minute about why should we even make our results interactive. Here, we have an excerpt from a research paper. Don't get scared by this wall of text. I don't expect you to read it. The point of this slide is to bore you. I'll just read a couple of sentences from this Nature paper about COVID interventions, which just came a couple of months ago. And it talks about current interventions, about like shelter in place drives down the R by some percentage. The posterior mean of R is 0.82 in Belgium and an average of 0.66 in other countries. Think a minute about how a random person from the sidewalk would react to such statements? Well, first, they won't even understand anything. And second, they might be bored to death. Uh, for a very similar finding, just let's look at what a Stanford lab did. This is an app created by the Mordecai lab in the biology department. And for very similar research on COVID interventions like shelter in place, they give a tool which is currently live online. And you can play with different levers like how early the intervention begins, and then it shows that the number of affected people decreases by a drastic amount. You can then also play with how the length of the intervention affects the affected people and so on. So what we saw here, two very similar messages being presented in very different formats. In the first case, we saw that it was passively presented in the form of boring statements. And in the second case, by these people from Mordecai Lab, it was presented actively, where the audience was allowed to interact with your findings to understand that story better. And this research in cognitive science shows that anything which is active leads to very high engagement because people are working to finding that out. It's more like an experience rather than just sitting back and hearing things. So now I'll present to you three different ways in which you can make your own results interactive. This is by no means an entire exhaustive list. These are just resources that have helped me personally to make my results interactive. First, we'll talk about Tableau, which is a private company making dashboards easier. Next is Google Earth Engine apps. It's a product by Google. And finally, we'll talk about Shiny apps, which is an open source project. First, let's look at Tableau. Tableau is a software which makes anything related to tables very easy to present in an interactive way. So here we have some pie charts, bar charts being presented from a tabular format. This is an app that we developed for the New York City DEP to help New York City residents understand what the effect of a future stormwater rate might have on their bills. So here you can see that some kind of residents are going to be paying more, $2 more, or $120 less, and so on. And this really helped the residents over there understand the different scenarios which might play out in the future for their own stormwater fees. Here on the left, I've also presented some other inspirational dashboards and tutorials which have helped me personally to make these apps, and you can get them by downloading the slides from the website. For part two, we look at Google Earth Engine apps. So if you don't have anything in the tabular format, but if you have a location related results like maps, then Google Earth Engine is really good at that because it helps in rapid visualization. Here in this specific case, we are presenting the effect of social vulnerability on wildfire risks. So the message here was that, wildfire risk is not really just an external trait related to hot and dry weather, but it also depends on how rich and poor people are, because that affects the vulnerability. And from personal experience, I've seen that these kind of dashboards, when presented at conference or poster sessions, the engagement just goes through the roof. People get instantly hooked to finding, oh, let me go and see what's it in my area or my neighborhood and so on. So it really helps in making it interactive. Finally, we have Shiny apps. This is what I would like to call like a beast mode of apps. It gives extreme flexibility in creating any kind of app you want, tabular, geospatial, non-structured data. The earlier example from the Mordecai lab was built on Shiny apps. So that example is presented here again. A quick comparison, if people are starting to think about how they can use these apps for their own research. So if you are repelled by programming, if you just hate programming, then Tableau might be a good option because it doesn't require any programming, whereas Earth Engine and Shiny do. Tableau, as I said, supports tabular data mostly. Earth Engine supports maps data, and Shiny apps supports pretty much everything. If you're just getting started with making interactive results, then documentation might be very key for you to help you build these products. So I've seen that Earth Engine lacks a little bit in documentation, so you might expect spending some time on Stack Exchange to understand how to build different toggles and levers. And finally, all of these are free for us students as of now, but Tableau moving forward may not be free for you. So to conclude, I want to present this quote from Andrew Stanton, who's a prolific writer and director at Pixar, making movies like Toy Story and Nemo. When he was asked what makes stories effective, he said, don't give the audience 4, give them 2 plus 2. In essence, what he's saying is that don't present everything on a platter, make the audience work for the message a little bit, or in other words, work for their meal so that they are hooked and get engaged to that story. Well, for science communication, I don't recommend following exactly that. We saw in the earlier sessions today how science literacy for an average person is very poor. So what I follow is not just give them 4, but also 2 plus 2. In that way, you can make your stories effective while also maintaining high engagement with your research. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. That was excellent. I really enjoyed seeing that. So if you were to go to something like Shiny Apps, how would you even start to think about which one? If you said it's just sort of this smorgasbord of potential apps, how would you even know where to start?
The first question I asked, that's a really good question. Thanks, Julie. So the first question I asked before even making any of my results interactive is, what does the audience care about? Like, I think Helen was saying that before today. So what matters to them? If it is something like the effects to humans, then I try to make that as an axis of my finding or what I'll be presenting. And on the other axis would be different scenarios. So probably the rows of a table would be different scenarios of, let's just say, sea level rise. And the columns would be how many humans are affected. Now, this is a table, but then when presented as an app, you can interact with what is the different scenario for sea level rise, and you can visually see live how it affects more and more humans. So I think about what does the audience care about first before making or deciding what the exact app look like.
Great. We have an audience question. Do you have a sense for whether the different platforms are better for different disciplines? For example, biology versus statistics versus languages?
That's a really good question, and my experience is quite limited in that. I'm coming only from an earth science background, but have just interacted with different apps. So I unfortunately cannot answer to what makes some product good for different fields. For my field, earth systems or earth sciences, Shiny Apps and Earth Engine, Google Earth Engine are both excellent products. For any slightly engineering related projects, maybe Tableau is better because it has a lot of different features of different charts that you can present. But honestly, for biosciences, I have no clue. So if anyone knows, they can write in the chat and help each other out.
Julie, do we have time for one last question?
No, I think we'll wait and go on to Andrea, but Linnea, perhaps if you want to read the question out, and then maybe Krishna, you could answer the question in the chat. That would work really well.
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. How would you go about publishing an interactive app in a journal, or do you use them only at conferences or on your lab website?
So if you go ahead and put that in the chat, that would be really great to answer that question.
Thank you.
We're now going to turn to Andrea Olson. She and I are living in the same space this morning, I see, which is, you haven't been there, is the mezzanine of the Brenner Earth Sciences Library and Map Collections, one of the best places on campus, we would both say. And Andrea is going to talk to us today about using story maps for scientific communication.
Okay, can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay. So as Julie said, I am a map librarian at Brenner Earth Sciences Library and Map Collections, which is behind me. So if we're ever back on campus, just know that there's this awesome place to come to. So I just want to talk real quick on using a platform called ArcGIS Story Maps for scientific communication. So I've been working here for about 2 years, and during that time I discovered this platform, and it's just been a really great way to communicate kind of complex or boring information in a way that's not boring. So just kind of a quick introduction on this. Like we're all kind of talking about here, in academia, we're all very intensively trained to communicate within our community using both verbal and textual methods. But the way that we communicate to each other is often boring, and it generally lacks kind of the prose necessary or the impact necessary to affect a broader audience. So I've found that digital storytelling is a really great way to be able to present complex scientific information to a group of people, a general audience, in a way that's engaging, it's eye-catching, thought-provoking. And one thing I've kind of discovered is, you know, if you're a researcher, you're in the field or in the lab, it's kind of this privilege that you have to see this firsthand. And I think this is a really powerful tool for kind of bringing people on this academic journey that you're on. So people that don't get to study in the field or study in the lab, you can kind of share this experience with them. And I think it's always been important, but especially now, I just think it's so important to be able to share just informed research, accurate research to the general public in a way that it makes them think, or it's easy for them to understand. Because I just think an ultimate goal is to have an informed public. We'll all benefit from that. So just a disclaimer, I'm going to be clicking out to different websites, so we're kind of bouncing around here. But first, just to get into what exactly ArcGIS Story Maps is. ArcGIS is a software suite for geographic information systems, GIS. It falls under the company Esri. Esri is kind of the Apple of geospatial digital mapping. So they've created this very intuitive plug-and-play online application for digital storytelling that allows users to combine the power of narrative, images, videos, sound, and maps to share their work, which with this, don't let the word maps in story maps throw you off. They don't need to be about maps. They don't have to have maps in them. But as a map librarian, a little biased opinion, include maps. I think people love maps. They're just a fun addition and provide this kind of geospatial context to whatever you're talking about or you're trying to share. So I'm gonna pop out to a couple examples here just to kind of entice you into start using this platform. So this is an exhibit or a story map that's available. It was created by the Jane Goodall Institute. So I'm kind of just gonna very quickly scroll through this just so you can kind of fall in love with this. So as you can see, they're bringing in images, they're bringing in custom graphics, different fonts, different colors to tell this narrative, to tell this story. So like Krishna was kind of showing before, you have these stats, scientific information, mathematical information that in an article or periodical, it's boring. But if you bring it into with a custom graphic with colors, it kind of all of a sudden changes the impact of it. So this is one example. Again, bringing in digital maps. You have interactive maps here, so you can click on pop-ups and learn that way. So just kind of this element of fun, engagement, interactivity, get your audience engaged in what it is that you're presenting on. So this is one example, and then I'm just going to show the example. Our maps team created this last year. So this was about mining maps, and one thing we did here was extract a bunch of data from mining maps to create a 3D experience. So this is all information that was extracted from a mining map, brought into the GIS software to create this really interactive experience. Just a really quick blurb about this. So this was actually named the Story Map of the Year, which the competition for this year has just been announced, and it's focused on sustainable development goals. So if anyone who's listening, if that falls into your wheelhouse, definitely contact me if you have a little competitive fire in you. I would love to see one of our students win the competition this year. So just keep that in mind. So one thing that may seem intimidating about this is you may feel like you're not a storyteller, or you're not creative enough to do something like this. But to me, that's kind of the beauty of the Story Maps platform, is it enables you to do that. So just storytelling, familiarizing yourself with the basics of storytelling, such as setting, characters, plot, conflict, theme, narrative. So start thinking about the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, and how you can plug it into kind of a storyline. And then being creative enough, that's the beauty of this platform again, is that there's templates, there's color and font themes to choose from. So even if you have no experience in website development or design experience, this platform enables you to create something that's engaging, that it's eye-catching. So then lastly, just real quick, I want to bring attention to some resources that are available to you. So there is a Story Maps gallery. I highly recommend checking this out before you start creating a story map, just to get inspired, kind of understand the capacity of this platform, what you can do with it. There's a Story Maps tutorial that I've created. It's a very step-by-step walkthrough tutorial. So if digital mapping intimidates you, or anything about the creative process intimidates you, definitely use this tutorial. And then also we have our resource guide. So I'm just going to click out to this real quick. So this is for the map collection and resources, but you'll notice on the left there's a multimedia storytelling section. So along with breaking down story maps, there are other digital storytelling applications that we're available to provide guidance on. So if anything like this is interesting to you, definitely feel free to contact. Our contact information is on this page. So yeah, that's it. My email is here. If you want to make a story map, contact me, absolutely. I love doing creative things and working with students in a creative manner. And if you're feeling intimidated by any of this, don't. Just a year and a half ago, I didn't know how to do any of this, and here I am now. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Andrea. That was great. Can you talk a little bit about how long it might take to make one of these story maps, and, you know, sort of how you thought about the pancakes and silver, and from your concept to being able to have something up for people to look at?
Sure. I mean, it really doesn't take that long. With the pancakes and silver, the mining map, that was an idea I think we established in July of last year, and then we were done and presented on it in September. All the content was there, you know, we kind of had to do some digging, but the platform is very intuitive. It's very plug and play. So to learn it is not difficult. It really just comes down to where you are with your content. Is your storyline developed? That is the most kind of arduous part of the process, but otherwise the platform is genuinely user-friendly.
Great, thank you very much, Andrea. Appreciate it. Okay, next up we have Dante.
Hello, hello.
Hi, Dante. How are you? I'm gonna and I'm gonna let you pronounce your own last name, and it's you're gonna talk to us about the art of science promoting creativity in STEM.
Yeah, exactly. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Does everyone see that?
Not yet.
Okay. Do this better. Okay, maybe now it's working.
Yep, we can see it.
Maybe that's display view. Sorry. Is that the display view, or can you see the actual presentation?
It's a display view.
Okay. Great. Thank you, guys. My name is Dante Zahidov. I'm a 6-year rising PhD student in Alberto Solea's group in the Material Science and Engineering Department. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about art and science, specifically promoting creativity and improving communication. The Art of Science is now a 10-year running annual event through the Material Science Department, organized by the student group, the Stanford Materials Research Society. And this past year we went virtual, and this was the first time we went virtual, and we had actually over 1,500 unique visitors from 30 different countries, so it was kind of a great success on our end, and trying to promote this idea of using art to better leverage ourselves as scientists. So just a quick recap and review. I'm actually going to show you guys the website. So now you can see the Art of Science 2020 exhibition website, just to kind of see how it is that we kind of portrayed our work. And so we had a lobby page here that welcome to Art of Science with introductory video showing our judges and kind of highlighting our past winners and the various artwork they did. And this lobby page then takes you to the Art of Science exhibition, where we have usually around 100 applications, 100 submissions from the Stanford community. We curated down to 30, and then you can see all the various submissions here. So quickly going back to my presentation now, and what I want to discuss with you all today is that art is a really powerful tool to promote creativity within yourselves and also improve communication with others. So I'll first start just by highlighting some of the various works that we've had. And so here, this is actually a first place prize from Art of Science 2017. And it was amazing work by Thomas Huffman and other physicists in Stanford physics. I started playing the video now, and hopefully you can see it. But at the bottom, what you see is 0.000001 seconds. And so this is time in nanoseconds. And this is a pulse of light hitting a human and seeing it illuminate. And so a lot of times when we think of light, we don't realize that it has some speed and it is an actual particle. And so when we turn the light on in our rooms, light comes instantly, but actually light is a process that takes time to travel. And using this video, people were able to show in an artistic way how light does travel but very fast. And so as scientists, using art, you can use art to kind of help people understand things of different scales, which I think is one of the things that scientists have to do. So going on, another piece of art, this was actually Savannah, and she won first place in Art of Science 2020. This is called The Body as Canvas. And so she's a human biology student that took patients that had diseases, so whether they had sprains or injuries in their legs, or they had kidney or liver diseases, or stomach issues. She took those patients and then painted on top of them. This is their actual real body paintings of their anatomy. And this helped people get a better connection to themselves and helped Savannah, as a biologist student, better understand the work she was doing. And so art also provides avenues for healing and self-understanding. Another work was by Hannah Wayman Steele in chemistry. This was an Art of Science 2020, and it's called When Art Goes Viral. And this is actually a really amazing and novel work, because usually this all represents various types of RNA. And this is the genetic material used in viruses. And usually you think about RNA in terms of DNA sequences. But what she has done is found a new way to visualize RNA structurally. And so each branch in each of these various viruses represents a genetic mutation in the code. And so you can see some of the large branch structures are very complex and have many branches. Here we see SARS-CoV-2, which is currently ravaging the world. But you can also see smaller smaller RNA molecules that aren't labeled. And these are RNA viruses that are currently known. People are researching, but they don't have a name yet. And from this visualization, you can immediately see that it's because they haven't become complex enough to sustain kind of large spread pandemic status. And so art also provides scientists ways to visualize their work in maybe ways they couldn't, because people did not visualize RNA in these ways before. Wiley Jennings from environmental engineering had a great piece called Poop at the Beach, where he showed California wastewater management data over the course of 2018 to 2020, and basically seeing how fecal matter comes up in our oceans and other wastewater systems. Art also provides ways of imagining different possibilities. This is a work by Michael Braun from Material Science. The top is an SCM image of a silicon nitride ball on top of a nanowire. And when Michael was working on this, he actually viewed it as a small world. And so art also provides us ways of imagining new possibilities. And in similar vein, this is work from Nick Love from Stanford Medicine, and this won second place in Art of Science 2017. And what he created are these beautiful mandalas of various microscope images that he takes himself and then collages into these massive mandalas. And so you can kind of see some of his work, and Nick is one of our frequent submitters to the Art of Science. This is his Art of Science 2019 piece, where you can see now these various tadpoles and other biological model systems that he worked with put in interesting and cool ways. And like Nick said, one of the main things for him, why art helps him as a scientist, is that it provides him that motivation to stay the extra hour to get those beautiful results. And so he was lucky enough to show some of the methods he used to work with. So to generate collages, he would take microscope images of stains of Corpora amalcea and kind of individually cut them out to the ones that he saw were the most interesting. And these are well known amongst the scientists and clinicians as being something very unique and beautiful. And so in his work, this is part of his scientific work, but he also takes a part of it to carve out and look through the lens and see what is beautiful and what is interesting. And so the way he gets his colors is through staining. And so I think a lot of artists a lot of times put constraints on themselves and to create their art. And so the same way as scientists, we also have our own constraints by the images and the systems that we use. And so we can use that to leverage and make art. Another work I wanted to show was Chun Tin's Waterloo Bridge. So what she has on the left is Claude Monet's watercolor piece. On the right is the piece she created. And they look very similar and beautiful. And what you actually realize is this was taken through a very sophisticated tool called the synchrotron radiation light source up at SLAC, and a technique called X-ray diffraction. And each of these individual components was actually like real physical data she took for scientific work. But then she was able to see in these three distinct images something far more beautiful. And so I guess the purpose of all these things was to show you guys is that the artistic process really challenges the scientist, A, to view their work differently. And that's kind of the creativity component. So the way that Chun Tin saw in those XRD images something far more beautiful, like a watercolor painting. And also it forces us to think of how to package our work. I think the only way we currently package work is through journal publications. And as we saw through some other speakers, there are more other ways we can communicate that work. And so by thinking of how can we portray this succinctly in just a single artistic image really improves our communication. So I encourage everyone here to start exploring art in your own work. And you get a chance actually to highlight this creative expression every year at Art of Science. Our call for submissions come on April, May, and the exhibit is in late May and June. This is our listserv, and please email me with any questions. Yep, that's me.
That's great, Dante. We have an audience question. What media do you accept as submissions? Does it have to be video, photo, digital media?
Yeah, so we actually are completely mixed media work, and we try to work with every single artist to try to highlight their things. We've had sculptures, we've had videos, we've had interactive, like visual GitHub type of interactions, and so all media are accepted.
Dante, thank you very much for presenting. This was really beautiful, and I think you have done such a great job of showing us how art and science interact. And I can't wait to go look at your Art of Science site while I eat my lunch today. That'll be a nice little break from Zoom meetings. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the fact that you met with us today. Thanks.
Yes, please. Thank you. And I'll put the link in the chat box.
Great. Joseph Makoka is next, and Joseph is another of our staff members from the library, and he's going to talk about imperfect yet compelling, the case for 3D digital prototyping post-COVID-19. Take it away, Joseph.
Thanks, Julie, and I'm excited to try out all the different tools that have been shared. I'll be talking about the preparation side of research. And this is just because of the nature of work that I do. I work as an academic technology specialist, while on the other hand, I'm a PhD student. And so I get to interact with faculty in two different, wearing two different hats. One as staff who wants to support their teaching and research, and then on the other end, as a student who is learning from them. And you'll see a little bit of each. So when in the title, it says post-COVID. I don't intend it to mean after COVID is gone. I just meant since COVID appeared. So that's what it means, how we might use 3D digital prototyping and tools for research and learning post-COVID. And just as we know, we've definitely hit a bump in our learning and research, and more so for the engineering learning, since things shifted online, distance learning for everyone, including little kids, adults. And I feel like most challenged are classes and programs that require a lot of in-person collaboration, on-the-fly kind of ideation and testing and feedback, such as product design. The guy to the right of that picture, David Beach, teaches the fundamental product design classes. And there are some of the things I'll share here are from what I've learned speaking to him and others. What I have discovered in the last few months since COVID hit was that we needed to communicate effectively the case for trying some of the tools that we had been prototyping. And one of them was a 3D printer on a cart. So there is a mobile maker cart that we started prototyping way before COVID. The intention was not that we were gonna have a spike in use of mobile or portable equipment, but we thought there was a need based on what we had learned from students. But it took a long time for faculty and students to latch onto this, but things changed after COVID happened. I feel like part of the challenge was communicating the importance of having such portable equipment so that students and faculty would see the idea, the goal, and the effectiveness, or even have a reason to try it. So just a quick overview. In the cart, we have electronics kits and some entry-level toolkits. We could include a computer if they need it, and so on. But that's not really the key. The key is making sure that students and faculty are able to have access to prototyping tools when they need them. And so I'm going to talk a little about the challenges and the lessons we've learned from this, and then how communicating around those challenges and lessons has helped to make this better. So one of the things that we discovered was being able to move tools and have students access them either in the classroom or in the dormitory or their residence or in the lab was a need that we were able to meet. And that's when we communicated that effective to the students and to the faculty, it made sense, especially during COVID. Modularity is something that we realized that having the ability to pick and choose which kits go together or which kits might make sense for students, and being able to either check out an entire kit or part of it was something that would be compelling. And we also realized that the Makerspace Room 36 in the basement of Taman actually needed a way to check out some of their tools. They had a problem of disappearing equipment around finals and midterms because students needed to do stuff away from the lab or the shop when they were closed. So we realized this was a good thing that could be communicated around the ability to check these out. It also goes with flexibility, and these also highlighted the possibilities for partnerships and trying out things that they may not be well equipped for, but which the libraries are equipped for. So being able to communicate these kinds of capabilities and affordances has served our purpose right. The other thing, and I know I'm running out of time, one of the things that we've realized is that there needs to be perpetual user research. You continuously have to be interacting with the users or patrons, and here we are talking about faculty, researchers, students, and so on, and trying to figure out what would serve them best and where their research and work is going. If things move online, how might we then serve that compared to if they were on campus? And this gives me, or has provided us, some thoughts on a way forward. So for instance, in preparing for the upcoming distance or hybrid learning, there are collaborations that I'm creating with faculty and asking to be part of the planning process, as well as being able to audit. So I'm calling it auditing their classes, but I'm also offering help in the sense that we will be able to see ways that we can support learning during that period. And so it's part of the communicating around. It's not like, oh, I want to come and sit in so that I can bring in our equipment. It's like, well, I want to come and see what challenges and opportunities arise, and this might help both your class and others. I will stop sharing and take questions or comments. I'll be curious to know what both panelists and participants think, and any other ideas you might have.
Joseph, can you talk a little bit about the kind of things that people are doing with the Maker's Cart in the last few months and over the summer and last quarter? I know it was checked out a few times from the engineering library. And what did people use it for?
We had several students who were in the process of completing their master's projects or other lab projects and had to vacate and leave the campus. Thankfully, those were local, and so they checked these out to 3D print mostly and iterate on projects. Some of them had ordered equipment, especially 3D printers, that didn't arrive because everyone was ordering them. And so that us having that mobile maker cart solved the gap between waiting and getting. And I was just gonna show this. So engineering students sometimes have to create the tool that they use in research. So this is a contextual camera that I'm helping on a project, and just being able to quickly 3D print and test things, plug it in and see how it's working really helps. So we create the tool that we then use in research.
Fantastic. All right, thank you, Joseph. I appreciate very much you taking the time to talk to everybody today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Our last speaker is Aisling Cheney, and she's going to speak to us about publishing a video article in the Journal of Visual Experiments, or JOVE.
Okay, hi, can you see my screen okay?
We sure can.
Great, fantastic. So yes, my name's Aisling Cheney. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Radiology in the lab of Michelle James. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about my experience publishing in JOVE. So the object of today in this lightning talk is just to, one, kind of explain a bit about what JOVE is, what is involved in publishing there, and why bother even doing it. So first of all, for people who aren't familiar with JOVE, it's called the Journal of Visual Experiments. And it's actually a methods-based journal, but what makes it really unique is that it does so by producing scientific videos with the mission to improve scientific research and education. And there's actually a huge variety of different research topics and techniques available. And this is what the website looks like. And you see here, if you click down on research, you can go to all these different topics, and you can actually even go to research. So this will be like different techniques, or you can go to education, where they'll kind of help explain different topics through videos. Oh, hello. There we go. So you can actually search for specific topics yourself in the search bar. So I wrote PET imaging here, which is positron emission tomography, which is basically one of the main techniques that I use in my research to be able to image neuroinflammation in the brain non-invasively, so in living humans and living animals. And when I just simply put in PET imaging, actually 292 results came up for that, because there's so many different topics, different analysis methods, different practical guides, different methods to be able to do this. It's a huge field. And it'll be the same if you want to search for anything that you're interested in. Say you're, for example, something I'm trying to start do is single cell RNA-seq. I can just type that in the search bar and try to find a video that will really show me that technique in detail. So what's really good as well is that Jove doesn't just use video, it also gives a written aspect. So it's really good for the visual learners and people who prefer to learn more traditionally by reading. This is just the example of what ours looks like. This is my paper here. It has a summary, abstract, all the normal stuff you get in a normal paper, but you also have this video up here in the top corner where it goes through the paper step by step, explaining the theory and also the very specific techniques. And why we chose this was basically because in PET imaging, not only the experimental design, but also the analysis is extremely complex and doesn't really allow you to recapitulate it in a traditional, even methods-based paper, especially a normal paper that you're trying to publish. You know, the method section is usually really small and doesn't really give you much description. So what are the steps involved in publishing in Jove? And I say Jove produced here because there's two options when you publish in Jove. One is to do Jove produced, where they actually come and have a whole camera set up and people come to the university and film you doing everything. Or you can do self-produced, where you publish the videos yourself, which I think is a lot more work, but we got them to come to us. So it was a bit easier. I do not have skills in filming. So the first step you have to do is, and I have a timeline on this to give you a bit of perspective of actually how long it takes, is you submit a written paper like you would any other paper. And that does contain a summary, an abstract, an introduction. A protocol, which is extremely important. The biggest part of this is a really step-by-step something that you'll have never written before in scientific writing, because it really is like you literally write every single little thing. So we do a lot of image analysis. So I have to say, you know, click on this button, bring this tab here, like do all these different steps. It takes a lot of time, but it's actually really good because then people can really repeat it. You also give a material list. So the idea would be that the person reading your article would be able to purchase everything that you have and be able to exactly reproduce it. You also have to have representative results. So they want to see example data that's ideally not been published before. So you can show it from the very beginning, from the setup to the actual quantification. And then it's just like you would in any other paper, you do a discussion where you discuss your applications, limitations, and it's a really good part to discuss the nuances of the actual protocol and why you've done it a particular way. So you do actually submit figures exactly like you would before. And we do a lot of PET imaging in mice, and we try to do high throughput imaging. So we do 4 at a time, which is actually just very logistically challenging. So we provided videos at the setup, which we call this the little mouse hotel. We put 4 mice in here at a time so we can image them under anesthesia. These are all our tools and the setup of how we do dynamic imaging, which means all mice have to be injected with this to quantify the tracer uptake that's injected into their tail veins. And these are just things that you don't need to know much about the science, but this is just example in some data that we did from a DMCAO, which is stroke model of mouse, and how we could see the uptake of inflammation in where the stroke was compared to the non-stroke mouse. Then it goes through really rigorous peer review. And I say rigorous because they actually have around 3 to 5 people, I think, review it, and people that may not necessarily be in your field, because they want to make sure that you're being very clear, and they'll give you really good comments to refine and improve clarity. Then you will resubmit that paper. And this is, now you've not done any filming or anything yet. You resubmit it and you wait for your approval. So that actual process took a couple of months for us. Then you get assigned, once it gets approved, that, okay, yeah, this is something we want to do, they get you in contact with a script writer. And I say script writer, it's somebody who'll oversee your writing of the script. So essentially, this was something I wasn't really prepared for, but it was challenging and fun at the same time, is you actually completely draft the script for the whole film aspect. You pick exactly what's going to be said, who is going to say it in your lab. Like say I had my PI say some parts, because I was very shy, and I said some parts, and I had one of my research assistants do another part. Then you also choose the bits that you want to get filmed, and that goes back and forth with the script writer until you have a good script in place, and then they will send out somebody to film it for you. And that takes about 1 to 2 days in the lab, and it combines action shots. So we have a lot of, I don't have the video here, but I'm happy to share it. We have a lot of videos of me like putting mice in a scanner and like setting everything up and all these different things, like kind of action shots to help the viewer to understand every single little thing that's happening. We also have individual shots where it'll be just, which was the scariest part for me actually, because they just put you in front of the camera and you have to explain your science. And it was really good actually, because you have to kind of get good at that like elevator pitch, or why are you doing this? What is the impact? And then you can self-record any computer tasks. And that was actually a huge part of this for me, because we did the experiments, but my favorite part, or the biggest part of the point of this paper, was to show how we can really consistently quantify the uptake in a stroke for this animal model. So what I did was, after they filmed us, I picked different parts of the image analysis. I had to learn this new software that they gave me, and I had to record every single click without fail to record the image analysis, which was fun, but definitely laborious. And then after that, you go back and forth with the production team, you submit your video comments, they'll give you proofs, so you can say, oh, I don't really like how this was said, or let's leave this bit out, or let's edit this. You get the option to do some reshoots, and you then get final approval. So if you think of where we started submitting the written section, that's not even writing it, that's just once you've submitted it. It takes about nearly a year to get it done, so it is a lot of work, but I'm going to tell you now why I think it's really, really worth it. So the main thing I think about publishing a video article such as this is just, it's such an effective way to communicate really, really complex methods that, again, you just cannot get from a traditional scientific paper. Usually the methods is such a small section, and trying to recapitulate or repeat anything that you read in that is so, so difficult. You might often have to reach out to the first author and be like, please help me understand a little bit more about the methods before being able to repeat anything. So that actually results in really effective and efficient knowledge transfer, which is really, really good for inside and outside your institution. So you're training people and you're giving this knowledge to essentially anybody who has access to this. And most of the videos, I think, are free. But inside your lab even, it's a really, really good tool to train and teach people, and to maintain that reproducibility within your lab as well as across labs. And that actually is really, really time and cost effective, because it's a time efficient, as trainees can get a real grasp of the process before embarking on hands-on training. And that really actually has allowed us to have a lot of students and summer interns, so they can learn something really quickly and effectively. It's cost effective because of less time spent training, but also as you don't have to waste precious resources, materials, and funding demonstrating the techniques. And this is really important for us because we deal with generating radioactivity and also with extremely sick mice who have had stroke or MS or Alzheimer's disease. So it's cost effective in multiple aspects. You also then, once you've published this kind of a paper, you have approved and published methods for papers and grants. So it's a really, really good way to put in your papers, or especially I found really, really good for grants and getting comments back being like, they don't really question your method and why you're doing it. They just go look at the video and they're like, oh yeah, okay, I understand this a lot better. And one thing I didn't expect was actually lab visibility. So I've had a lot of emails from people being like, oh, I see that you're like an expert in this PET imaging thing. Like, can you help me with this? Or I've had people with actually even within Stanford being like, I saw this video, we would love to incorporate this into our research. Can you help us do that? And some really good collaborations and discussions have come out of this. So in summary, I think Jove is a fantastic resource if you want to learn something new. Also a fantastic resource if you want to share your knowledge. And it's a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it. Yeah, so thank you for listening. And that's just my lab who definitely helped me a lot to get the videos together. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisling. We have a couple of questions. Julie, is it okay if we go over by a couple minutes?
Sure.
Great. So we have a question about how peer review works for Jove. So from your flowchart, it looked like peer review happened just on the printed article. Is there a peer review for the video part as well?
It's The peer review, I don't think is for the video, but they have a lot of people who review it within Jove once the video is there to make sure it's clear. But then they also get you to review it to make sure it's portraying what you actually want it to be portraying, if that makes sense.
Right. So are there opportunities to refilm parts of the video if there's mistakes? That seems cumbersome.
Exactly. And that's probably actually one of the things I should have mentioned is why it took us so long post-production is my PI is a perfectionist. She's amazing. She was like, oh, I'm not quite sure the sound was great in my video. So she actually completely reshot her bit and we resubmitted it. And Jove were completely lovely about being like, yeah, we understand. We can't, like, that's absolutely fine. Please just resubmit it in your own time. And they were really, really, really kind about it, but also really good at keeping in communication.
Great, thanks. And one last question. I know Stanford University Communications puts limitations about filming on campus because of trademarked images. What permissions do you need from the university to submit to Jove?
Oh, we didn't need any as far as I know. We spoke to, all our imaging was done in a conference room for the one-on-ones and then in our small animal imaging facility for the experiments. So once we decided, okay, this is something we really want to submit to, we just let the small animal imaging facility know that there'd be filming in there and would that be okay? And they were totally fine with it.
Great. Julie.
Ashley, thank you very much for that great presentation. And I did want to let people know that this year we were able to do a number of subscriptions to Jove resources. We're going to have access to analytical chemistry, lab animal research, Physics 1 and Physics 2, general chemistry, organic chemistry, and microbiology. So the library definitely sees the value in Jove as a research tool, as a learning tool for folks, especially in a setting where we can't come to campus. And how do we get this information out to people when they can't be with us in person? So I'm really excited to hear you talk about it more, Aisling, because we spent a lot of time deciding if these are something we wanted to get. And so to have you talk to us about how they're created was quite illuminating for us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
I'd like to thank all of our Lightning Talk speakers. This was a great session. I found it really, really interesting. And so thank you all for participating. And thanks to all of you who have come to listen to the talks over the last 2 days. All of these have been recorded. We'll make sure they go up on the GearUp site as soon as we've done some post-processing of our own, and we'll make sure that everyone has access to these. We would like you, if you have other ideas to tell us about in terms of things you'd like to see in the future, please do, and I'll put the bit.ly link in the chat window so that people can give us your feedback about what you'd like to see. So thanks all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.